Pretty rapidly, didn't
Okay, that's great.
Okay. That us in public session? Okay. So, as usual, just welcome everybody to this session of the Education Committee and advise members that the committee meeting will be recorded and broadcast throughout Parliament buildings and online. And I would advise anyone in the public gallery that they're welcome to use mobile devices as long as they're in airplane mode and all devices are muted. You can connect to the Assembly Wi-Fi and password details are available on the gallery rules, and it is not permitted to take photographs or record any of the meeting. So you're all very welcome, and we will make a start with the agenda. It's a big agenda today, so we'll be moving through it as rapidly as we possibly can. So in terms of apologies, I don't have any apologies, but would note that Cara had advised her intention was to join the meeting via Zoom, so hopefully she will be able to join us at some point through the proceedings today. Any other apologies that members are aware of? No others, that's fine. So we will move on to item 2, which is chairperson's business. So again, we'll try and be as brief as possible here. I would just want to draw members' attention to the informal meeting of the committee that was held with the Northern Ireland Childminders Association on Tuesday. And there's a note of the issues discussed at page 3 of tabled papers and a briefing paper from NICMA at page 5. And that's there may be issues there that members want to raise in the briefing with the department later on childcare. Item 2.2 in chairperson's business, I just want to highlight that I'd received a request directly from the charity Angel Eyes NI seeking a meeting with the committee. I'm just going to propose that we deal with that in forward work planning if members are content to dispose of that at that stage. I also wanted just to propose that we very quickly, while we have as many members in as possible, take a brief item in closed session, because I'm just not sure if everybody will be here right to the end of the meeting, just to discuss diary planning over the next number of weeks. Has everyone agreed? We just do have a very brief closed session. So if we could move into closed session quickly.
Committee Room 29. Sound. 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 Committee Room 29, 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 Sound.
More than we need to, because we have a lot to get through. Is that us back in?
Not just yet.
Okay, so that's us back in public session. So just to confirm, for just the record in terms of the discussion there, we had a bit of a review of members' diaries over the next number of weeks, and we will revisit a firm decision on our meeting schedule for the next number of weeks at next week's meeting. Item 3 then is declaration of interests. Does anyone have any interest they wish to declare for today's meeting? No. That moves us on to matters arising. Just very briefly, we're all aware that we had the concurrent meeting with the Economy Committee last week, but that's dealt with in detail at item 6, so I think we can move on from that at this stage. Item 5 is the draft minutes, and they are of the meeting of the 29th of May, and they are at page 8 of your packs. So I propose those are a complete and accurate record of proceedings. Are members agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark. Okay, so item 6, and again, we'll try and deal with this very briefly, but we probably do have a couple of actions arising from the concurrent meeting with the Committee for the Economy. So the draft minutes of that meeting are at page 15 of your packs. So I'd want to propose, certainly from my perspective, it was a constructive and helpful meeting, and it did give us a good initial insight into some of the issues around careers, guidance and education prior to the publication, which we hope will be soon, of Dr. Hughes' report. I think there are definitely opportunities down the line to run another concurrent committee meeting, probably on the wider 14 to 19 framework, or to revisit the specific issues around careers, and that can be picked up in the weeks and months ahead. But I think in the first instance, I would propose that we write to the Chair of the Economy Committee and thank them for proposing the meeting and for helping facilitate it. But I think there were also, beyond that, some specifics that did come out of the meeting. And from my recollection, if anyone wants to add to this, I would suggest that we should be writing to the Minister for Education to urge consideration very urgently of the need for a clear action plan, benchmarks and targets to measure outcomes for the delivery of the 14 to 19 strategy, and specifically in terms of that agreed joint work programme that they referenced in terms of careers. And I would also suggest that there is a need potentially to write to the Education Minister to seek his views on whether there's a need for a more robust legislative framework for young people leaving special education and their next steps in terms of career guidance. Were there, first of all, our members agreed with those actions, and secondly, were there any others that anyone wanted to add? We all agreed?
Was the second one the Economy Minister?
No, I think the Education Minister, yeah, on that. Unless there's a feeling we really write to both ministers, I mean, we can do that if it is, so we can go to both ministers on that. I certainly was struck by the reluctance to have anything measurable in there at all, in anything that was being discussed. So, we agreed? Agreed. Okay, great. Okay, so I need to sign these minutes off. Yep. So, okay, thank you. And this copy as well. Okay, thanks very much. Okay, so that moves us on to item 7, which is a budget briefing from the Department of Education. And I'm just going to say we have 3 briefings in today, so we are going to move through this quickly. So I really am asking for members' assistance. Can we get straight to questions? And I will do the same with the officials in terms of just making sure we're not retreading stuff that's already been presented in terms of answers. But if I can ask everyone to work with me on that so we can get through the business. So if you want to bring the witnesses through, I will draw members' attention to a briefing paper from the committee clerk at page 21. The Department of Education briefing paper responding to the committee's letter of the 24th of April, and that's at page 8, and then on 15 of table papers. We have assembly research papers from the Children's Services Corporation Act on pooled budgets, pages 50 to 89 of your packs. Northern Ireland Fiscal Council's budget report at page 89, and correspondence regarding the budget at pages 167 to 189. Is there anything I've missed there out of table papers that needs to be mentioned? No, that's grand. So at this stage, I will welcome the officials who are joining us today. So I have Neil Palmer, Acting Director of Finance from the Department of Education, Stephen Van Houten, Acting Deputy Director of Finance, Department of Education, and Stephen Cray, Acting Director of Investment and Infrastructure from the Department. So you're all very welcome today, and thank you for joining us. We have a really big agenda today, so I'm going to ask in terms of an opening presentation that it is absolutely up to 10 minutes, and I would ask that when we then move to questions, we're going to aim to keep that to 5 minutes per member in terms of question and answer. So if I could ask that we steer clear of repeating anything that's been covered in your briefing, it's drawing out any new information or clarifying anything that's in your initial presentation. But again, you're very welcome, and hand over to yourselves for initial opening remarks.
No problem, thank you. I have a very short opening note you'd like to know, so we'll keep it brief hopefully. I'd like to thank the committee for providing the opportunity to brief you on the education budget today, so thank you. I fully appreciate that you'll all be very keen to get a detailed briefing on the 24-25 resource budget. However, I hope you'll understand that given the scale of the challenge which this year's budget presents, the Minister has not yet made his final budget decisions, but we'll still do our best to brief you as best as possible today. And hopefully you'll be understanding that I'm perhaps unable to give you robust and detailed responses that you might want in certain respects, but again, we'll do our best. Now, I'd like to cover off four key areas in my opening statement, and again, I'll keep it brief. Those 4 areas are the initial interim budget that we've already allocated to our schools and our NDPBs, the implications of the 24-25 budget outcome for education. I'll give you a brief overview of our approach to the June monitoring exercise, which was cleared by our Minister this morning, and I'll give you a short overview of our provisional outturn for 23-24, which I think we included in our written update for you. As far as the interim budget goes, you will recall the Finance Minister's paper of the 13th of February on public expenditure approach to budget 24-25, that's a mouthful, indicated that departments were not likely to have budget allocations by the 1st of April 2014. Consequently, at the outset of 24-25, there was a requirement to provide clarity over the financial resources available to our schools, the Education Authority and our other NDPBs. That's to allow departmental budget holders to process payments to third-party bodies and generally just to facilitate business continuity in the absence of a final budget outcome. This budget was provided in terms of allowing our arm's length bodies to plan in the absence of a final budget allocation. For the Executive's 24-25 budget, the Department reported a funding gap of over £900 million, close to £1 billion, which is eye-watering. The defunding gap, though, was only a smaller part of wider £3 billion pressure across the Northern Ireland bloc, and this was against what the Finance Minister had at that time to allocate, which was an extra £1 billion, so the pressures were 3 to 1. So against that backdrop, the Department had neither any basis to expect a significant budget settlement over and above our indicative budget that would match education's estimated resource requirement, nor any basis upon which to anticipate what level of additional funds that may have been allocated to us. It was for this reason that the interim budget allocation was based on our opening position for 23-24 the prior year, which seemed like a realistic point to at least get the year started and to allow business continuity. So anything else which is allocated over and above that will be additional to our schools and to those bodies once we get final decisions from our Minister. In terms of the implications of the budget outcome for education, so our opening planning budget was £2,577 million. At that time, we assessed that against our pressures. We had bids, which we submitted as part of the exercise, totalling £777 million, which again is quite eye-watering. In addition, we also submitted bids relating to transformation and the Executive Childcare Strategy, which added up to £132 million. So that 777 plus 132 is the 900 that I previously referred to. These bids were submitted as part of January information gathering exercise. Following further assessment in April, the Department's position was revised down slightly, taking that pressure of 777 on the resource down to 772 million. Departmental allegations were agreed by the Executive on the 25th of April 2024, and at the highest level, what that gave education was an additional 300 million. If we want to park transformation and park childcare, it was an additional almost 300 million to address those 777 million pounds worth of pressures. And also we got a small amount of 0.7 in respect of peace funding. Then moving to childcare, in addition to the funding that I've just mentioned, the Executive set aside 25 million for the childcare strategy, which you'll all be aware, which is currently held centrally, pending Executive approval of those proposals brought forward by the Task and Finish group. And I have a small update on that for you today as well. So against this backdrop, we have some difficult decisions to take, and we'll get to that. My colleague Paul Brush will be attending later on this afternoon, I believe, so he'll be able to give you more detail on the outcomes with regards to the childcare funding. So Table 1 in the written briefing that we provided for you in advance of today's session compares the Department's opening baseline position with the 23-24 closing position. From that table, the committee can see that the Department's opening baseline for this year is marginally less than last year's closing position. So you can see that we're already up against a significant challenge, which I will take you through hopefully this afternoon, and which will all inform our approach to June monitoring. So turning to June monitoring, in the absence of significant additional in-year funding, the Department estimates unfunded inescapable pressures of circa £223 million or thereabouts, and I can give you more detail on that as the afternoon progresses. And that relates in the most part to statutory demand-led pressures. So those are pressures that are going to crystallise whether we fund them or not, and that's above and beyond our current allocation. And then in addition to that, we would have to take the decision, and again in the absence of the Minister's final decisions, this is just our assessment, that we would have to take the decision to park about £250 million worth of pressures that we simply cannot fund. So there were pressures that we would say, well, if we don't have the funding, we can't progress those. Now, the most significant one of which would be the EA pay and grading review, which you'll all be aware of, which is at about £180 million. Now, you'll appreciate as well that I can't say too much about that today because it's subject to ongoing negotiations with the unions and the EA and DOF. But again, I'm happy to expand on that at some point. And as well as those inescapable pressures, there were circa £52 million of high priority pressures, and quite simply, in the context of the pressures that we're talking about, I think anything that was high priority in comparison to inescapable, those were parked, and for the time being, they were not submitted for funding. So in short, education will require substantially more funding during this period if the department is to avoid a significant and detrimental impact on our children and young people. In terms of June monitoring, the pressures facing education at the start of this monitoring exercise are essentially unchanged from the executive budget was agreed 1 month earlier. So for that reason, the inescapable pay and demand-led pressures, as well as those key pressures, which I've outlined in the briefing, form the basis of June monitoring. Given the scale of education's inescapable pressures combined with the anticipated amount of funding available for the executive, no bids were submitted for high priority pressures, as I've previously alluded to. And in addition, as part of the June monitoring return, the department has asked the executive to consider a bid in relation to EA pay and grading, and that's in tandem to the ask to the Chief Secretary of the Treasury to bring forward funding to settle that. But again, I don't want to say too much there. That was at the request of the Finance Minister, that bid. And very briefly, just a touch on provisional outturn for last year, and that'll be the end of my statement. I'll pass to Stephen, who has a very short statement as well. In terms of 23-24, the department's provisional outturn was 1.2 million, and that's a 1.2 million pound underspend, which is about 0.04% of our budget. Our capital DEL underspend was about 0.5 million, which is about 0.18% of the capital budget. Now, the reason for the resource DEL underspend is to 2 or 3 small things. There were about 0.4 million pounds in respect of excess consolidated fund extra receipts. So those are unanticipated receipts which we got towards the end of the year. We're not allowed to spend those, we have to give those back. And there was also a small underspend of about 0.6 million, which related to our, right across our NDPBs, just very, very late small underspends, which all add up. And then there was another small underspend on a ring-fenced fund, which again we're not allowed to utilise. We have to give that back to DOF. So as far as we are concerned, that was a good outcome. And then in terms of capital, the 0.5 million falls well within the departmental target of achieving 98% spend, which I'm sure Stephen can confirm. The vast majority of that underspend related to Fresh Start capital funding, I believe. So I don't want to drag things out, so I'll end there and I'll let Stephen give you a brief update on capital.
Chair, I'm not sure in the 10 minutes whether
nice and brief, please. Yeah, it would be great. Thank you.
Well, I'll keep it as brief as I can. Neil referenced the April executive agreed budget for 24-25. That provided the department with a capital budget of 254.3 million. That excludes Fresh Start funding with a requirement of 80.3 million for the 24-25 year. Compared with the opening position in 23-24, that reflects an increase of 80 million, which is most welcome. 20 million of the funding allocated, as you'll be aware, was earmarked by the executive for the Stroll Shared Education Campus. That leaves 234.3 million for all other capital priorities. These priorities were drawn from the information gathering exercise commissioned by the Department of Finance in February. This gave us detailed information on the capital funding needs across the education system under 3 broad categories: inescapable, high priority and desirable. And to set the context of our need across the system, total inescapable out of that exercise was 271.8 million. That compares to the budget allocation of 234.8. High priority was 180.3 and desirable was 10.8, and I should say inescapable was essentially anything in contractually committed. Pressures were compiled as part of a bidding process, as you would expect. Once we get the funding envelope, we then relook at those priorities across. And as the Minister has stated on numerous statements and responses, difficult decisions continue to have to be made in terms of capital. You'll recall the extremely constrained position in 23-24 when our 3 priorities were existing contractual requirements, keeping schools open and pupils safe, and providing places for the most vulnerable SEND pupils in our schools. The Minister's capital budget strategy continues to prioritise those three areas, but if I can just give you a very, very quick, the broad areas for the budget strategy in 24-25 are the inescapable contractual, statutory remedial and emergency works, SEND capital investment programme, which the Minister announced a few weeks back, curriculum-led programmes, and the Minister intends to make some comments on that in the coming weeks, progressing a small number of major works that had been paused and a number of school enhancement programme projects that have been paused, and delivery of the flagship Stroll. Have I time to take you through the breakdown, or do you want to just stop there?
No, I mean, if you give us the breakdown, and then
Okay.
we'll move to questions after that.
The Minister has now agreed the capital budget allocations for 24-25 based on that funding envelope. In summary, these are for SEND capital investment programme 51.9 million, inescapable major capital works and SEP contractual commitments 80.4 million, education infrastructure ICT 32.4 million, minor capital works delivery 62 million, curriculum led programmes 10 million, major and SEP projects to advance in procurement and construction 20 million, other capital, which is arm's length bodies, needs, etc., 2.6 million, and then the Stroll earmarked. If I may just add to that, you will note that that adds up to 279.3, which is 25 million overcommitment on the budget envelope. We believe at just under 11%, that is a prudent overcommitment to allow for slippage and change. We also intend to bid, and we have submitted bids under the June monitoring, which I'll be happy to come to as part of your questioning. We will continue to monitor that. We have actions we can take to again pause projects to bring the budget back and keep it in line. You will recall from last year that the budget the pressures on the budget were huge, and we had to exert a downward pressure entirely through the year from June right through, and the executive additional funding that came in late in the year in January-February time was very well received in terms of helping us balance our budget. I have a lot more I could say, but I'm happy to stop there, Chair.
And look, hopefully we can draw out on both resource and capital. So thank you for your presentations there. I just wanted to sort of just get it out there at the start. I think there was a general disappointment from the committee that we are getting this briefing after the budget bill. So I would just want to just really note that at this stage, and we would hope as the year progresses that we would maybe get more timely budget briefings, because it did present quite a challenge to members in terms of how we actually scrutinised that process, as we didn't really have a lot of detailed budget material to be working off. So we just want to put that on record, that we would hope there would be more timely engagement on these issues in the weeks ahead. Absolutely,
we appreciate that, and we had hoped that we would have had final decisions to bring to you. That had been the plan, but unfortunately that's been delayed. So I'm happy to take that.
No, that is fine. So the main question I want to ask is really about that process of the bids that went in as part of the budget process. So you've detailed that sort of after it was a bit of a downward review, but it was 772 million of inescapable pressures went in bids for that budget process. 296 million, give or take, was awarded as additional allocation. So just with a very quick calculation, that's 475 million of inescapable pressures that have gone unfunded. But it seems that language has now changed, and we're not talking about 475 million inescapable, we're now talking about 223 million and 250 million of key pressures, which is a different phrase and a new phrase that I don't think is one that's typically used in the budget bidding process. So could you help the committee understand why some of those inescapable pressures are now no longer categorised as that? And if that does call into question the budget process in terms of how much confidence both the Finance Department and this committee can have that the pressures being detailed as inescapable are indeed inescapable. Yeah. Is there a risk that you bid for everything and you know you won't get it all? And how do you then make an assessment about what is truly the priority in there? I find that slippage a little bit concerning.
No problem, I'm happy to talk you through that. So you're talking about this roughly 455 million there, or sorry, 475 million. They are all inescapable. But whenever we get a budget outcome which isn't sufficient to meet all of our needs, we need to realistically look at our pressures and how we categorise them. And what I had alluded to there, maybe quite quickly in my opening statement, is that we would look at those into two different categories. So we would split those into 223, what you've already heard of as being truly inescapable, i.e. they're going to crystallise no matter what, whether we fund them or not, that's going to happen. then there's that other 250. Now, we would still consider those to be inescapable, but we would look at them and say, okay, well, realistically, we can't do that. We can stop that. But to give you an idea of what's in there, it's 180 million for pay and grading. It would be about 40 odd million, or just under 40 million, for a teacher's pay settlement for September 23, and the next big one in there would be £30 million of inescapable maintenance pressures. So we would still categorise those as inescapable. We think they should be treated as inescapable and should be funded. However, if we don't have the funding, we need to look at how do we separate them, how do we look at how we start to manage this, and that's the reason for what and it is just words, it's us trying to find a way of how do we manage a budget which looks insufficient.
And I understand the distinction that you're drawing there. I think just in terms of looking at this across the board in the executive, I'm not sure every executive department took the same approach, and I'm not sure that necessarily is exactly how the finance department would perhaps provide the guidance that you can bid for something as inescapable, and then after you don't get it, you say, well, it wasn't really inescapable. It was a key pressure, but it wasn't inescapable. I just think if there's going to be transparency in the process, do we not need to understand where those pressures sit at the point we're actually looking at what the finance minister is allocating? Is that not helpful for everybody to ensure there's proper accountability of what the department really needs?
Yeah, well, I would still maintain that extra 250 are inescapable pressures. At some point, teachers will need a pay settlement for September 24. At some point, we do need to address the pay and grading issue, and at some point, we do need to address our major maintenance works, or minor maintenance works. So I appreciate your point. We're always very, very open with our colleagues in DOF. We have a good relationship, so it's certainly not a case of us not being genuine in our approach. But I understand your point.
I think just for scrutiny purposes, it's helpful to know, and I did just note that slippage in the language. Just one other question, because I think we are quite short on time, and again, as you say, we are not at a point where you actually know what the allocations are going to look like. In terms of how this budget will land, with probably the largest proportion of it will be going to the EA for the aggregated schools budget, and then for the other aspects of the EA block grant. Can you give us any sense of the level of funding that is going to school budgets? Are we looking at an uplift? Are we going to see a scenario where schools are going to be resourced in such a way that they're not going to be running deficits, and that they will be able to meet the new requirements of payroll, of pay costs with the pay uplift for teachers? Yes,
I can go some way. So obviously no decisions have been taken by the Minister yet, but our normal approach would be to protect as much as possible school budgets, and we're aware that some of those very significant inescapable pressures, i.e. the 223 and above that, are pay related. So we have certainly advised the Minister on where we think the funding should go, and either way there is a big chunk of funding there to be allocated. It doesn't matter what way you chop it up, there's still going to be a £223 million truly inescapable shortfall, sorry about the words, and ultimately the vast majority of our budget does go to schools in the EA, so yes, there will be an uplift, but I think that's as far as I'd be prepared to go.
So, I mean, there is an acknowledgement that in terms of the position of schools running deficits and the EA carrying that deficit, yes. as your sponsor, you're the sponsor department for that body. I mean, ultimately, that's the department. Ultimately, is carrying that deficit. I mean, is that going to go some way to addressing that in this?
Hopefully,
in this financial year?
Well, as I say, I can't go too far in the absence of the Minister's final decisions, but as I say, there's a big chunk of money there, and that's where it goes to. So.
And by the same token then, in terms of the EA block grant, obviously a considerable need for uplift to deliver SEND services. Are we anticipating that is going to see an uplift as well in terms of the money that will be going into SEND services? And if you could also separate out what is likely to be going towards SEND transformation, so how is that likely to divide out?
I can't give you any great detail on that. I would anticipate some additional funding would go to the Education Authority block grant. I couldn't give you any detail on how much I think would specifically go to SEN. However, I can assure you that when it comes to the block grant, we're very much aware of the SEN pressure and the trend when it comes to the increasing SEN costs. Sorry, apologies, what was the second part of that?
In terms
question?
of SEND transformation, we're very aware that SEND services need investment, but we're also acutely aware the transformation piece is absolutely critical.
Yeah, and you'll be aware of the ongoing end-to-end review.
So in terms of the resourcing for that, really, is
at this point in time, I think we're awaiting the outcome of the head of the Civil Services working group on transformation. We have bid through that process for additional funds there, so we'd be hopeful to get something there.
We'll watch that space. I did note there was an announcement about reinstatement of the funding for the Book Start Fund that was made in the Assembly this week by the Minister, which is welcome. I just wondered why that sits apart from, because I think it looks like no allocations have been made. I'm just curious to know why that one particular budget line has just had resource allocated.
Apologies, I can try and get some clarity for you on that. I know it's a very, very small amount. I'm not sure why that's been singled out and been announced in
I was just interested to know, as it's a welcome
Yes,
investment, but it seems when there's no clarity on, lots of other people are waiting to hear how the budget's going to roll out. It's a fair question. Certainly a surprise in the chamber earlier in the week, but welcome that is getting some resource. No, that is fine. I think in the interest of time, I'll pass over to the Deputy Chair at this stage.
Thanks, Chair. We had a debate in here yesterday evening about educational achievement / underachievement. And the issue of greater cooperation among departments was one of the issues that was discussed. And this committee has heard from witnesses previously who say that the Children's Services Cooperation Act should be given greater effect. So I'm wondering how you, as officials tasked with finance and budgets, fulfil your responsibilities in regard to that particular act.
We would be subject to a number of bids from across the department to what their needs are, and with regards to the Children's Needs Act, we wouldn't have a particular role ourselves in assessing whether or not we're meeting our needs there. That would be up to our policy colleagues. However, I am, and I'm not sure if you're aware of this, there's been a recent announcement about the RAISE programme, which we've confirmed that we have secured €24 million through the Shared Ireland funding to fund that over the next 2 years. With potential to increase that for the 2 years after that. But apologies, with regards to satisfying our requirements when it comes to the Children's Needs Act, I wouldn't be briefed closely enough to that today to advise you.
So are you saying you don't really know, or it doesn't come within your remit, or I'm not sure what you're telling me?
Well, it doesn't come within my remit, so I would have policy colleagues across the department who would take the lead on that. And when it comes to their funding needs, they will bid to the department alongside everybody else on those needs.
Let me sort of raise a couple of examples, because last year I was very critical of some of the cuts to programmes that the department made. Things like holiday hunger, provision of digital devices, Happy Healthy Minds. And I'm just wondering, given that those are areas that have, for example, clear implications in health, the Department of Communities would also have a role in some of those particular programmes. Have there been any discussions between your department and other departments in regard to joint bids to replace those programmes?
My understanding is that there are discussions that go on across the department, particularly between ourselves and health and occasionally between ourselves and justice, to do joint bids. However, with regards to those specific programmes, I think Holiday Hunger and Happy Healthy Minds that you mentioned, I'm not aware of any ongoing discussions on those. Now, certainly from a financial perspective, which is just a financial perspective, not the policy side, looking at the budget outcome that we've got, as unfortunate as it is, it would look unrealistic to us, certainly from an education point of view, to start to look to in starting those programmes up again. As unfortunate as that is, we need to be mindful that when we first started those programmes off, we utilised COVID funding to do so, and as that COVID funding has run out and our own budget has become squeezed, I think, if I recall correctly, our last minister did keep Holiday Hunger going for a while, but it's quite simply not affordable in our current budget outcome. But I can certainly find out across the department if there have been any additional discussions with regards to other departments on getting those programmes up and running again.
It seems to most people that it makes sense to pool resources around issues like this. Yeah, the Children's Law Centre, for example, has said there's been a piecemeal and minimal approach to implementing the Children's Act. So, I suppose what I'm really asking is, within the Department of Education, are there no discussions that go on around the Children's Act and about pooling resources and having discussions with other departments?
Well,
It doesn't seem to be up there anyway.
certainly if there have been discussions with regards to pooling resources, specifically with regard to the Children's Act, the Finance Director haven't been involved in those discussions, but that's not to say that there aren't people across the department looking into it and engaging with colleagues in other departments. But I couldn't give you any more than that today, apologies.
Maybe some follow-up correspondence the committee could consider in relation to that. I've not any other indications at this. Kate, do you want to come in? Or anyone else, Robbie?
Just a very brief one. Thank you, Chair, and thank you for your presentation. Can I ask how much money is being spent on development of the childcare strategy, given that the 25 million that has been earmarked is for interim measures? So how much is there for the rest of the childcare strategy?
Okay, so I'm not sure I fully understand your question. So are you saying about what are we currently spending on it before we bring the 25 in?
Yes.
So at the minute we have a small team in the department who are working on the childcare strategy. This is all predicated on, we have bid for the 25 million, so weirdly the 25 million that was assigned to childcare actually sat with DOF, and we've bid for it as part of June monitoring to draw that 25 down into DE. So all of our efforts to date will be predicated on securing that 25 million, and that will be... You don't
actually have that yet?
No, we don't.
But it's been ring-fenced in the budget.
It's been ring-fenced, and there's been a task and finish group which have been working together and have put proposals forward to the executive which have been accepted. So the next step for us now is to get our hands on the money, which we'll hopefully do so in the next few weeks.
The next few weeks
things
you'll
will
get the
start
money.
to flow from that. I would hope so. That all depends on the Finance Minister's deliberations on June monitoring.
That's actually quite worrying, because the subsidy scheme the expectation is that will be rolled out by September. So if you're not even going to have the money for this in the next couple of weeks, I mean, these are questions we'll put to Paul. But
yes, exactly. I had that conversation with Paul today, and he'll be able to brief you on that. So yes, it is.
You don't have the money yet.
No, we don't have that money yet. It wasn't given to us as part of the budget outcome, and we have to bid for it. And June monitoring is the first opportunity that we've had to do so.
I don't think that was really made very clear that was going to be the case when it was announced. Okay, thank you. Well, the questions we'll put to the officials later on.
Yeah, and we can raise them as well. I think there's items of correspondence arising here all over the show. But Robbie, if you can come in.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe I'll give you a chance. I'll have another question, but I think at Kate's point, it's really important to maybe give confidence to those people out there in terms of that because the Minister has made a statement in regard to bringing forward by September measures. And that would be incumbent, obviously, of having that money secured. So maybe if you could just give us a wee bit more confidence around it. But also, you've indicated that a bid has been made for the June monitoring round. Could you tell us what's involved in the bid and the details of what has been bid for and the fiscal amount that has been made by the Minister, if it's possible?
Yes, I can. I don't want to say too much because I don't want to influence the discussions around pay and grading. But what I can tell you is our June monitoring position is no different to the position that I've just explained to you with regard to what do we see as being our inescapable or truly inescapable pressures. So that's exactly what we've bid for. If we take pay and grading out of that because it's being dealt with as a separate process, we're coming in at our bids of around about 300 million.
So the June monitoring money that we've been made aware of is in around £250 million, yes. And the Education Minister's bid for 300 million?
Yes.
Of June monitoring money?
Yes.
And that includes the £25 million of child, not that's
separate to that, yes.
And the Minister has also, with the Finance Minister, made a bid to Treasury for an easement in the money that was negotiated in specifically around the £180 million for the pay and grading.
Yes.
Has the Minister made any other bids to Treasury with the Finance Minister in regards to any other easements or flexibility in the financial package that has come from Westminster?
There is one other bid as part of June monitoring, not necessarily as part of future easements, but again it surrounds the pay and grading issue, so I would prefer just to leave it at that.
Right, I'm content. Thank you, Chair.
Okay.
Thank you.
Cheryl?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much for the update. I think we touched on it earlier, but just in terms of procurement, in terms of the EA, is there any scope there or any movement that the EA are going to change any of their procurement practices? I know it's been raised about cleaning, maintenance, all those things which are costing schools an arm and a leg, and that's putting them obviously into a deficit. So in terms of procurement, do you see yourselves moving forward in any new way to save money?
Yes, so this is not an unfamiliar question. In terms of EA procurement, I I'm aware that very recently the EAU have embarked on, or the EA have embarked on reviewing some of their maintenance contracts, and that is to allow more flexibility and more locality, I think is the word that was used, with regards to schools procuring stuff. So I think previously it would be fair to say that schools felt that there wasn't an awful lot of choice and were sort of railroaded into going down a certain road whenever they required a certain service. I understand that the EA has rolled out 2 new contracts already and plans to look at more, where there are more providers in local areas to give schools more choice, and there's also consistency across localities in terms of cost. That's as good as I can give you. I don't know, Stephen, if you can embellish on that.
Well, no, I suppose the only thing I'd add is that, you know, I suppose with Northern Ireland public procurement, you know, schools are, you know, they are kind of compelled to comply with that, and you know, that does require, you know, it requires a competitive tendering process, which is maybe a little bit more than just, you know, picking up the phone and contact, you know, getting 2 quotes, and that does, you know, create a little bit of regrettably some bureaucracy, and I have been, you know, I have had discussions with school principals and stakeholders, and I'm aware of their concerns, but at the same time that has to be balanced with, you know, the requirements, you know, to comply with Northern Ireland public procurement policy, the issues around, you know, say for maintenance, to make sure that, you know, the people coming in are adequately insured, that they've been, you know, safety checked, that sort of thing. So that would be the only unhelpful thing that I would add to our comments.
And our minister has asked us to keep an eye on this, so it's not something. It is something that's on our radar.
No, it's a huge issue, and I know I speak to schools. I'm sure everybody probably speaks to schools that are paying ridiculous amounts of money for pens, pencils, sellotape. It's just not feasible. And obviously procurement is meant to be value for money, so I think it's a huge issue, and it's putting a lot of schools into that deficit there, which is obviously then having a major impact on the department as well. So that would be good to try and get some more feedback about that, if that's a type of pilot. I'm assuming what you're describing there, a pilot project.
Yeah, I don't know if it would go as far as it's a pilot project, but it's a process that they've kicked off.
And then see how that goes.
Yes,
forward.
exactly.
But no, it's
and I think my colleague Stephen also had something
just
to
if I may, on the infrastructure side, obviously procurement timescales are fairly well set for pre-qualification and the actual tender process. But what we'll have to do is wrap around all the other governance around that to make sure that we're improving, you know, our speed of turnaround and such like. What hasn't helped over the last number of years is the market uncertainties and the inflationary pressures, which has led to a number of our procurements having to go back to a fresh procurement, and it's not purely because the business case has been exceeded. It's where a number of our tenderers had not were not prepared to stand over the tendered rates because of just the way the market was. But we do need to improve on that. The timescales, we probably have to look at that, but they are set by regulation. And I'm talking major works, minor works, and skill enhancement programme works, and probably maintenance is what you were really referencing there earlier.
But particularly the maintenance and the cleaning, to me, seems to be major issues at the moment, where schools can actually see we can get this done at a far better price, and there's a frustration there. You know, whenever it's a major build, it's a different kettle of fish, I suppose, but in terms of that smaller work, you know, schools can, and I think they could do that a lot more efficiently, and there's the frustrations there. But I appreciate the update. Thank you.
We're in an unusual situation where members are not using all their time. Robbie has asked to come in again, so it'll be for a very, very brief question, Robbie.
It was just an issue raised with me this week, and I think I've answered it correctly, so I'm hoping that I've got it right here. So the question was in regard to the teachers' pay settlement and the budget that were given to schools to cover that. The question was to me, does that impact the overall budget of the school in any way? So in terms of, obviously schools are paid per pupil, is my understanding, and the principal to the Board of Governors then pay the teachers. Are not paid directly by the EA or department, I think. So it's basically in terms of that, so that the additional money that was got for the teachers' pay is accurately given out, and there's no detrimental impact on the school to be able to meet its other costs.
Yeah, I think there's probably 2 parts to that question. I'll let Stephen.
Yeah, well,
the arrears and the.
Yeah, well, I suppose in terms of the back pay element, that would have been accrued for by the EA at the end of last year, and that'll be just paid out to schools on the basis of what the actual cost of the back pay was. In terms of the recurrent cost, Going forward, that'll probably just go through the in all likelihood go through the common funding formula, which would need to be rerun. And then that money would go out on a per pupil basis, as opposed to the actual.
Has that been quantified for 24?
Well, we know what the recurrent cost is, but in terms of in terms of the minister's kind of final decisions with regards to the final opening budget.
So we know what would need to go into the formula as additional to cover that one pressure.
I'm just thinking in terms of that. Hopefully, this isn't. I'm not overcomplicating this, but the financial year started at the end of April.
Yes.
And pays have went in for May. They'll go in June. And the budget for each school is obviously.
Yes, and currently their budget is based on an interim budget. At some point, we will give them a final allocation, and that's where we'll be taking account of. We are aware of what the additional pressures are. Again, it comes down to our minister's final decisions. But I suppose if we, maybe to answer your question a bit easier, is if we entered into the hypothetical world where the minister's going to meet that pressure in full, so we would ensure that yes, that full amount goes into the formula and gets shared out to schools. We would be running the formula again after the minister makes his final decisions. So if schools' current budget, which is an interim budget, will increase in the event that the minister was to fully fund that.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
Okay. That's okay. Yeah, I've got that. Yeah, that's fine.
Kathy?
Oh, no, sorry, I wasn't indicating. I was just
You weren't indicating,
there.
you were just dipping out, that's fine. Are there any other indications at all at this stage? No? Okay. That is the end of the evidence session, so thank you for your time. We'd agree some follow-up actions I think arising from that, but we thank you for your time, and we would ask just that the committee gets timely briefings on this process from here on in.
Absolutely, thank you, and we will forward on the details of our June monitoring bids now they've been confirmed. So, thank you.
Cheers.
Just while the officials are making their way out, there's a few things I think in terms of actions, but please keep me right if there's anything at all that I've missed. I think there was a question around the Children's Services Cooperation Act to ask if there are any specific areas, including holiday hunger, I think, and Healthy Happy Minds, primary school counselling or emotional health and wellbeing interventions of any kind, that the department is proactively engaging with any other executive department on to utilise the provisions in that act to facilitate funding. Is that a fair summary of your question, Pat? So I think if we agreed, we could raise that. Were there any other items at all that arose there? I mean, there was the childcare stuff, but I think maybe we can draw that out in this evidence session. But there perhaps might be some questions that we need to put in writing if we don't get clarity, because I think there is a concern there that announcements seem to have been made potentially before funding secured. I hope that's not the case, but we maybe just need some clarity.
I mean, that was really surprising to me, and I don't know. I mean, this is my first time as an MLA, so I'm not used to how this works, but it does seem very strange that there would have been that announcement about how that money is going to be spent, and then to say that they're bidding for it and it's going to be a couple of weeks. It's very strange to me.
We'll follow that up in the next session and leave open written correspondence if required. Cheryl, was there anything in relation to the procurement issues that you think?
I would like to get an update on that to see how things are going, because it's a major issue, and as far as I'm aware, they are trying to improve their procurement practices, but I think it's something we need to keep an eye on.
Seek an urgent update from maybe both department and EA in terms of specific actions in relation to improving the procurement practices.
And there was your point about Book Start.
Yeah, I think just, I want to be very clear, I welcome the funding for Book Start, but it does seem odd when we don't have, there's no other budget detail being provided there, so it'd be good maybe just to understand the rationale for that one individual item. If members are agreed, we just seek some clarity on that, because obviously Deputy Chair there raising holiday hunger and other there's lots of funding pressure, so it'd be good to maybe just get the rationale on that. I think also in terms of Robbie's points around the pressures on school budgets with teachers' pay, I'm not sure we really landed on the answer to that in terms of whether or not school leaders can be assured that the budget settlement that they'll receive as a school will cover those pay and uplifts in full.
Because more or less basically said it would be a ministerial decision based on the overall budget allocation, obviously, and Still think I think he alluded to it, that he gives more information on the monitoring bid, because I think at this stage now there needs to be a lot more clarity around what each of the ministers are bidding for, because we'll have that compressed pot and competing agenda. So useful.
I think it would be worth maybe asking for information in terms of how that will be approached in terms of school budgets. Are there any other actions arising from that we wish to raise? No? Okay, so if we're all agreed on that? Great.
Great.
Okay. So just before we move on to item 8, which is our briefing from the Northern Ireland Equality Commission, I just wanted to note that Cara has been in touch to ask for a formal apology to be noted, so if that could just be noted, please. So moving on to item 8, that's the Northern Ireland Equality Commission oral briefing. So if you're able to bring witnesses through, if they're here, if they have arrived, just double check. Yeah, that's great. So I would refer members to the briefing paper from the committee clerk at page 194. And then a briefing from the Equality Commission on childcare and early years, and that's at page 195 to 200. We have research papers from the Assembly Research Service, pages 50 to 89 of your packs, and then information on the Chief Commissioner directly at page 233. And then finally, the response from the Department of Education to the Equality Commission's recommendations at page 234. So those are all in your packs. Hopefully everyone's had a chance to refer to those. So just while you all get settled, extend a warm welcome to the Education Committee this afternoon. Thank you for your time today. I will welcome Geraldine McGahey, the Chief Commissioner of the Equality Commission. We have Darren McKinstry, Director of Public Policy and Strategic Engagement. We have Catherine Barr, Senior Policy Officer, and Chris Jenkins, Senior Policy Officer, and all from the Equality Commission for Northern Ireland. So it really at this stage is just to say welcome and to hand you over for opening remarks. We do have a big agenda today, so we would ask that absolutely up to 10 minutes for opening presentation, and then we'll try and keep each question and answer from a member to 5 minutes. So hopefully members will be getting straight to questions as well, so that we can cover all of the issues. But it's over to you really for opening statements, and we'll go from there.
Thank you very much, and thank you members for the invitation to attend today. We've all been introduced, so there's no point in me repeating all of that in the interest of time, but bear in mind that this is our first appearance before this committee and under this current mandate. So just to remind you that the Equality Commission is charged with promoting equality of opportunity and challenging discrimination, and providing advice really to the Northern Ireland Executive in relation to equality issues. We have a very long record of advising of the overwhelming need for a childcare strategy and the development of early years provision within Northern Ireland. Early years provision and childcare are so important to our society for two key reasons. It's well evidenced and internationally accepted that access to early years provision, especially high quality provision, is linked to healthy development and educational success. It also reduces social inequalities and attainment gaps between children from different backgrounds, including socio-economic. Equal access to provision is also crucial for ensuring that parents, particularly mothers, and carers generally, can fully participate in the marketplace, in the labour market. I want to take a moment to address the importance of childcare first before focusing on early years provision issues. Childcare and employment are inextricably linked. Parents, particularly women, juggle employment and caring responsibilities every single day, or often they make the choice not to work at all. The lack of a flexible, accessible, affordable childcare infrastructure in Northern Ireland has been an unyielding problem for many years. Many executive strategies have repeatedly stressed that employment is a key driver for economic and social well-being and a key route to social mobility and inclusion, as well as a route out of poverty. While labour market outcomes for women have shown improvement over the years, it's 50 years since the enactment of sex discrimination legislation, and accessibility to employment remains an issue for so many women. Women are almost 4 times as likely than men to work part-time, and the most recent labour force survey shows that nearly a third of women are economically inactive compared to 22% of men, and over 1/5 of these women are inactive due to family and home care commitments. It compares to 6% of economically inactive men. Northern Ireland's childcare and early years provision is lagging behind the rest of the UK and Ireland. We can no longer afford to be left behind, and it's a time for real action, and it's needed now. The Northern Ireland Executive has a real opportunity to enhance women's economic independence by making the right choices in the design and the implementation of a childcare strategy. It will benefit not only women, but our wider society and our economy generally. Moving on to early years learning, access to early years learning or education has been shown to improve educational outcomes for some of our most vulnerable children. It has significant benefits for children most at risk of educational underachievement. Indeed, the Independent Review of Education in Northern Ireland highlighted that the child's experience in the first few years of life has an enormous influence on the outcomes they achieve at school and in adulthood. It found that excellent services have an enduring positive effect on educational performance, particularly for disadvantaged children. It also found that investment that could improve access to special educational needs services and provide support for other specific types of needs, as may be experienced by disadvantaged families, newcomers and Roma and travellers, in the early years could provide a significant long-term saving, as well as improving long-term outcomes for these children. International research also shows that high-quality early years provision provides long-term benefits for both cognitive and social and emotional skills. Children who spend longer in early years provision have better educational outcomes. And it's been found that high-quality early years provision particularly benefits children from low-income backgrounds. So accessible, affordable, high-quality provision not only supports family income by ensuring that parents can work, but also supports children's development, well-being and success in later life. And I would say to you, surely every child deserves the same start in life and equal opportunities in how their lives might develop. But unfortunately, it's simply not the case. From our earlier work in this area, we identified several concerns regarding inequality in the access to childcare. A key concern was in relation to disabled children who may face difficulties accessing suitably adapted facilities or specially trained staff. And research commissioned by the Department of Education in 2023 found that 46% of parents responding whose children had disabilities, special needs or other additional needs said that they had experienced real challenges in accessing childcare. Parents and carers are also coming to the Equality Commission seeking advice and sometimes legal assistance in respect of educational provision at preschool and school. It's really important that provision addresses the specific needs of children from across the full range of equality groups, including children from ethnic minorities, particularly newcomer and traveller children, and children, including indeed older children, with special educational needs or disabilities. It's also clear that there needs to be cross-departmental working on this issue. Departments cannot work in isolation, and this may be an area where the pooling of resources as provided for under the Children's Services Cooperation Act might be particularly important. The Department of Education needs to work with the Departments for Economy and for Communities to address wider issues such as stereotyping, the value of care, and ensure flexibility in employment, training and education in order to advance equality and better facilitate participation across the full range of equality groups. But parents and carers must also be involved in the design and the delivery and the monitoring of the strategy and related services. We also need to see comprehensive collection of data across the full range of equality grounds to gather information on participation and uptake of the provision, as well as identifying any barriers or enablers that there may be for specific equality groups. Because without this, how can we ensure that the strategy meets the diverse needs of parents and children and that no one's left behind? In conclusion, this matter has been a long-standing area of interest and concern for the Commission, and we appreciate the interest of this committee has shown in our recommendations so far. We indeed welcome that the Education Minister has confirmed that our recommendations will be considered as his department develops an early learning and childcare strategy. But I just want to thank you for listening and we look forward to working with the committee, the department and other key stakeholders to ensure that we achieve an early learning provision and childcare that meets the needs and will continue to meet the diverse needs of children, families and wider society, but very much in a collaborative way. So thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, and thank you for all the supporting materials as well that came through in advance. It was all really helpful. Could I just ask then maybe to broaden some of that out, or to go into a bit more detail perhaps from the broader outline you've given in terms of the Minister's recent announcement on the interventions that are being proposed in relation to early education and childcare? What would your assessment of those be from an equality perspective in terms of to what extent is that ticking the boxes you've highlighted?
Well, you'll appreciate that because of PERDA we can't really go into the detail of that too much, but like the rest of you, we have read it and we've read it with interest. But very much waiting for the further detail that must come behind that so that we can properly assess it, because without that detail, there's still words on a page. So I believe that detail will be coming forward in the very near future, and we're happy to come back to the committee to discuss that in more detail then.
That would be
Have you anything you want to add?
Yes, thank you. It's a big problem to solve, but the crucial thing in solving that big problem is that it doesn't just cater for the masses. You know, obviously as the Equality Commission we're very clear it needs to cater for the diverse range of parents and families that are there, but also for the children that are there and for those who are providing care. So it's particularly important that in solving the big issue they don't miss the focus on those minority groups.
And sort of to pick up on that then, one of the groups that we have been concerned about are both children with SEN and their carers in terms of making sure that they can access quality early years and childcare provision. Does the Commission have a view in terms of what the appropriate interventions would need to be in any strategy to ensure that particular cohort can actually access really good quality early years provision in the educational space and access the childcare that they need?
At the very start, I would say that it's not just early years for children with special needs. It can be later on into teenage years as well, because I think there are a number of elements that need to be considered, and that's also sort of how the rest of the family cope and how other children are provided for as well while the attention is taken by the child with special needs. But it's really crucial that the needs of special needs are taken into account at any disability. And I'm going to invite one of my colleagues. Do you want to speak, Chris, on this?
Yes. Well, it's a significant issue, and you'll be aware of the increases in the amount of children with special education needs across the education system as a whole. The independent review of education also indicated that there's been an increase in the numbers of children with special education needs within early learning settings, an increase of 120% since 2015. So it's the scale of the challenge is significant. It's really important that the needs of those children are appropriately addressed. So ensuring that there is a specific approach to addressing any kind of physical adjustments that are needed within schools. The teachers are appropriately trained and have the support to address different challenges that children have. Within education broadly, we highlight the need for mainstreaming of equality considerations throughout education, which includes for preschool and early learning settings. So ensuring that equality considerations are built into things like the curriculum, but importantly also built into teacher training. So teachers have the kind of support that they need to deal with the range of different challenges that children with special education needs or disability may present with.
Can I maybe just add to that? Yeah. That it's really important that where at all possible, and it's a reason why there needs to be collaboration with the Department of Health and others, that where children with special needs and disabilities require therapies, that there's a way found to introduce those into that kind of early learning provision setting. But I think Catherine would like to come in relation to the childcare.
Yes, so it's just, and just to follow on from what Chris and Geraldine have just said, there are some pots of funding available to help with special educational needs, disability, additional support. But what DE sponsored research has found when they spoke to providers, just over 10% of providers were able to access that funding. So it's looking at how things like that, assessing how those have worked and how that can maybe be rolled out and made more accessible, because we know that providers want to do the best for these children, you know, but it's making sure that they're able to. The same research from DE also found that providers felt that they hadn't as much training as they may want. They may have difficulties releasing staff to get to the training when there's issues with staff retention and recruitment. As you know, margins can be tight, so letting people out for a day or two to get training on SEN or how to deal with particular disabilities can be difficult. So it's that wider infrastructure around it, I suppose, to support staff to do their best.
Just one final question, and I'm sure that a lot of the early year stuff will be picked up again, but to take it to the other end of the educational journey for young people leaving the education system, I mean, we'll all be aware of there's a Caleb's campaign running at the moment, you know, really strongly led parental campaign about the need for better protections for young people leaving education with a statement of special educational needs, very often leaving special school, and a concern that there maybe needs to be some legislative protection to ensure that some of those rights that are afforded by a statement of special educational needs in the formal education system carry on beyond that from an equality perspective. Would you have a view if we need to do anything more legislatively to ensure that that journey, you know, through the next step beyond formal schooling into college or employment is better protected?
I actually met with Caleb's mother yesterday. A very interesting set of circumstances and quite heartbreaking. I think there is an issue in terms of, at the very least, signposting and having a proper pathway through the process. I believe parents are left quite isolated and floundering in terms of where they should be going. Our education legislation covers up to the age of 19, and in other jurisdictions that's somewhat different. In fact, we have a Children's Commissioner that deals with children and young people up to the age of 25. Rather than give you a direct answer at this stage, I think we need to look at it in a little bit more detail. But I think it's fair to say that no matter which jurisdiction you're talking about, little happens in terms of policy implementation without a legislative driver. And I think it is worth considering the scope of the legislation and perhaps arguing that it should be amended. But rather than follow what is happening across the water in GB, I think we need to be cognizant of the fact that the House of Lords have actually been quite critical of that in a recent report. And we should look to see what best practice is before we implement or develop new legislation. But I think it is really important that our children and our young people who have special educational needs to go from a special school into an adult setting at the age of 19 will be very traumatic for them. And I think we need to provide, I think morally, we need to provide more support. But I think parents do very much need very clear pathways, and that needs to be taken into account as they move forward.
Really helpful, and there's undoubtedly really good provision out there, but it's sometimes even knowing it's there is part
it's the
of the
pathway
challenge.
and the signposts.
Yeah, no, and I think this is something the committee will be picking up in the weeks ahead. Deputy Chair, were you looking to come in?
Thank you. It's interesting you mentioned the Children's Services Cooperation Act, because we have been discussing it with the previous panel who were in. I'm just wondering if you have had any communication with any of the departments and how you think, given greater effect to this Act, could increase equality in our society, because you know, we talked about some of the cuts that were made last year, the likes of holiday hunger, provision of digital devices and Healthy Happy Minds, you know, where there is a case for greater cooperation across departments. And, you know, those cuts disproportionately affected the most vulnerable children in society. And I'm just wondering how, given greater effect to this Act, could assist greater levels of equality in society, in your view?
I've actually spoken about this Act way back last October when we were being very critical of the budget and how it was being rolled out across departments. And I think we need to be cognizant of the fact in the way in which departments are structured and how budgets are used. But I think there is scope for much greater use of a pooling of resources. I think the spirit of the legislation was to, or the intent of the legislation was to make improvements for children. I think that's been lost. I think greater use of that legislation is absolutely essential because we are in austere times. They're not going to get better anytime soon. And most of these strategies and policies are cross-departmental. So why would one department ignore the work that's been undertaken by another department when you have the same aim? We have an outcomes-based approach to how the programme for government should be delivered. So we should all be working towards common goals. And I think greater use of that legislation to ensure that every single department and organisation in the public sector who has a role in ensuring that a strategy is delivered fully should be cognizant of that and work with their colleagues on a collaborative basis to make the best use of the very little money that we all have. Darren, do you want to come in? Or?
Yeah, briefly, and then Chris. Yeah, there's always quite a lot of talk about co-design, but co-design is quite often focused on external stakeholders. What's really important, to pick up the point that Geraldine made, is co-delivery. There absolutely has to be a pooling of the considerations of the departments to see how best they can deliver from their respective remits. And the example of transitions from a second ago is exactly it. There are always issues with transitions, and so it's always something that needs looked at. But by definition, it usually can't be solved by one department, because it's not just a moving through a system; it's quite often moving into different systems. Chris, do you want?
Yeah, just to build on that. Returning to the issue of special education needs, the sharing of data in transitions between different departments would undoubtedly be helpful in terms of planning those transitions and having more effective processes for children with special education needs. But broadly, in relation to the Act, there's guidance that's been developed by the Department of Education on how to use the Act. We are suggesting that there should be consideration given by the Department of Finance to also create guidance on how the Act might be used. Within the Act, there's provisions for sharing and pooling of resources, and guidance on how that might be done between different departments would be helpful. There's also a provision of the Act that requires there to be a report on the implementation of the Act, and as far as I'm aware, that hasn't happened yet.
Okay. I just want to go slightly off piste on the second question. In 2020, the Equality Commission said that the COVID pandemic had the potential to exacerbate educational inequalities. I'm just wondering, could you describe how the impact on educational inequalities of the sustained use of academic selection?
I'm going to pass that over to Darren and Chris. Their focus is on education.
Yeah, when we spoke during COVID, there was clearly a wide range of impacts that COVID could have. Not just in relation to selection. Obviously, selection has had a different vehicle for delivery before COVID, and it's changed again now, and those impacts are still there. And the Commission's on record as calling for the need to look at selection at age 11, but there are many wider impacts as well. We were very mindful of, for example, the loss of access to expert provision during preschool and school years, the loss of access to our families who wouldn't have the abilities or the equipment at home to be able to educate their children. And it's important, not just on that selection journey, but through education, that steps are taken for a number of years now to address that, because that deficit will persist through the system and will manifest. We know academic selection has an impact on children from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. We also know that COVID has that impact. So there's an even more important issue of looking at the different equality groups post-COVID to see what actions can be taken.
Cathy, you were next.
Thanks, Chair. Just to go just a wee bit further in that, but maybe bringing it more into childcare. In the recent announcement, there was the Sure Start and the expansion of Sure Start, and in terms of tackling inequalities and hitting those most disadvantaged areas. I just want to get your view on, is that the right way or the right path to go down in terms of hitting those inequalities? Sure Start are fantastic and they do amazing work. But there is a postcode lottery, when it comes to that. There might be one family who, just because of their postcode, cannot get access to it. So I just want to see, is that the right route to go down in terms of tackling inequalities?
Thanks very much. I suppose, firstly, just to say, as Geraldine said, it is a pre-election period, so we can't get too into the detail of what was announced. But what is important in any scheme that goes forward is it's considering how it can help different equality groups, and that's different disabilities, different ethnic minorities, and then looking at socioeconomic status as well. Although socioeconomic status isn't a protected characteristic under equality legislation, we know that people from lower incomes, that creates barriers for particular equality groups, and it is cross-cutting there. In terms of Sure Start in particular, we've referred to research from Dawn Purvis that looked at Sure Start and, as you say, some of the restrictions on that. We know, as I said earlier, there are those pots of money in different schemes, but they're not necessarily accessible to all providers. There's lots of ways of doing it, to be honest, and what we would say is that we need to look at different jurisdictions and learn lessons and follow best practice. So, for instance, we referred to the access and inclusion model in Ireland, which we understand is being expanded beyond just preschool to help children with special educational needs and disabilities access early education. So looking at those kind of schemes, what's working elsewhere and what lessons we could learn and use here.
Yeah, there's a wider, higher level point I want to bring in. Obviously, in whatever the model of delivery is, we're looking at outcomes. We want to see better outcomes, and for us, obviously, as the Commission, we want to see that across the equality groups. A key thing in targeting the outcomes by equality groups is knowing, who you've got in front of you and what their challenges are. So whatever the provision is through government or out into the organisations that it funds, we have to be clear that data is collected on the equality groups using the service and their progression, because it's by that information that we can then see, whether via Sure Start or via other programmes, either what delivery needs to be made or what tweaks need to be made to delivery. Obviously, Sure Start is broadly an area-based programme, but we need to ensure that whatever the delivery mechanism, that it's delivering the specific needs for those equality groups, and the needs for a child who has English as a different language is clearly very different for a child who has special educational needs, and it needs to be tailored for that.
And just on that point, of those children that do speak English as a second language, do you think there's enough provision at the minute for that?
Well, I can just come in to say that the research that I referred to earlier, it didn't have as big a sample size perhaps as it would have wanted for English as a second language, but it suggested there was issues, particularly in relation to information. So especially for people who are newcomers, they maybe don't have family and friends who've been down the path before, so they don't know what provisions there are. The different systems of support, tax-free childcare, different benefits and so on, can be confusing to anyone, never mind for people who don't speak English as a first language. So that information is a really important point.
You do reference that, I know you do reference that about the data collection and that in your document. What is the issue there, or why do we not have that data now, and where do we need to get to in that?
Well, I suppose, and it's something, to be honest, we raise in lots of different areas where we work, that it can be difficult to know how services are working for different equality groups, and that's not looking just at how things are working for disabled children for a whole, or minority ethnic children as a whole. We need to know how it's working for different subgroups within that. So again, to go back to that DE research, there were issues raised about how families with children with disabilities were able to access services, but we don't know, maybe some things are working well for physical disabilities, learning difficulties. We need to break things down at that level so we're able to know what needs to be done to help different equality groups and the subgroups within that.
It's something that really applies to every single department and every public service. Data collection is historically poor. It is getting better, and there's work being done. TEO are developing a pilot using NISRA to look at data sets and create that bank of data. But we're way behind in where we should be, because if you even look at our Section 75 duties and applying the equality principle to policy development, in the absence of data, how do you know that your service is actually meeting the needs of your users? And we are on record at every meeting that we have ever had with the committee and the public sector generally, where is your data? Please improve your data. We want to see disaggregated data, data that can be manipulated, data that can illustrate how individual equality groups and those intersectionality areas are all identified, and you can fully understand what's happening. You want to come in there?
Yeah, it's
Just very briefly for this to
okay, so it's really just to underscore that point. Data can sound dry, but if you don't have the data, you can't target your interventions, you can't track your impacts. And there was no better example than during COVID, when actually beyond some commentary on gender and a little bit on age, actually in Northern Ireland, we could say very little what was happening by COVID in terms of equality groups. We had to rely on Ireland and GB as nearby neighbours. So I think that really underscores, while there is some data, it's not effective.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you so much. It's so good to see you here, and I'm really grateful for the work that you've done on childcare, because it is an equality issue, and I think that there are so many people who have campaigned and should be given credit for getting this to where it is, the recent announcement, but I think your organisation, the authority that comes from that, has really helped with it, so thank you. I just want to put on record my thanks to you for the work you've done. I agree, the point about information is so important, and I think that's something that we could flag up with the department about how they intend to better provide information for all groups on access to childcare. And I'm really interested in the discussion around data, and I'm glad that we've been focusing on that. Where are they doing it really well in terms of collecting data, particularly around kind of the quality groups that you're focusing on, and what should it look like within the Assembly? So which, is it right that TO is leading on that? What else should we be doing, and what is a good system? What should we be aspiring to?
Yeah. I suppose sometimes it can become overcomplicated. The top line for us is that whatever the key measures of government are, so whatever you decide they are, so whether it's in the PFG or within the departments, when you're asking the question about what that key measure is, also ask about the Section 75 equality groups. It's no more complicated than that, but rarely that is done. So where we do see data collection, so for example, we've been doing work, Chris might speak about some of the bullying work we're doing, we see some of the data collection occurring, but not across the grounds, and that's generally the pattern that we see. So that's, at the top level, that's what we would set that out. The other thing to be mindful of is sometimes there can be TO and NISRA are working on this equality data system at the minute. We've asked for, or data for the PFG really, we've asked for the equality aspects to be much more explicit and easily accessible within that. But it's important not just to get drawn into the big, large surveys like the census and the LFS. We also need to see it mainstreamed through all of the government data collection, the departments themselves. When they ask a question, they should also be asking the equality categories.
Okay, thank you. I have time for one more.
Yeah,
Geraldine, you talked about employment being a key part of it, and can I just ask what the Commission's position is on flexible working and legislation in terms of flexible working, because obviously for people with caring responsibilities and childcare, that's really important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's why I had suggested that there needed to be cross-departmental working for Department of Economy and communities really to assist in this process, to support and encourage employers to allow flexible working, to enter into those agreements so that the balance of childcare and working responsibilities can be balanced and balanced to the benefit of everyone. It's not about making life easier for people, it's much wider than that. So we would be very encouraging of any strategy that could support employers to offer flexible practices, not just for their own employees, but the childcare providers themselves to have flexibility in terms of how they can train their own staff into various specialisms. Do you want to add?
Yeah, I was just going to add as well, employment and flexibility in employment is obviously a really important issue, but it's also flexibility in training and education too, so that people, and this is especially mothers, are able to access education and training that might help them get into employment in the future as well. But certainly we've been calling for more flexible employment practices for many years, going back in the CEDAW in previous years. On our 2016 gender policy priorities, flexibility featured heavily within that.
And it's not just building flexibility into whether the employers or the providers, but as you're well aware, it's building the flexibility into the childcare so that it fits, it dovetails with your life. But it's also about addressing stereotypes, because we don't want to increase flexibility so it's just women that take it.
Yeah.
We absolutely have to address the stereotypes.
Thank you.
Robbie, you were indicated next.
Thank you. Couple of wee quick ones, and thank you so much for your presentation, guys, and your work. One of the groups that I haven't seen in the submission and hasn't been talked about today is care experienced children or looked after children. In regards to this, has there been any consideration given to foster carers, kinship carers and adoptive parents, especially in those early stages? Because you'll understand there's a big pressure to try and encourage people to take up these options, and we have unprecedented numbers of children now coming into the care system. And in that regard then, sorry for making this a bit longer, but obviously Ray Jones had the Children's Social Care Services Review, which I think is very useful in that regard. So is there, that's first question. And the second question then is in regard to the efficacy, effectiveness, and maybe not of the DDA, the Disability Discrimination Act. It's certainly, from my perspective, outdated. And in regards to the children with a disability or a special education need in those early years, is it effective enough to be a useful piece of legislation? And if not, is it time to do something about it?
Yeah. I'll make a few comments and then I'm going to ask the others to speak. In terms of looked after children, foster carers, they are all included in that whole parent carer topic that I referred to when I was speaking. We don't make any distinguishment between whether you're a parent, an adoptive parent, a foster parent. It's all of the same, and the same responsibility rests with the Department of Health being responsible for that corporate parent role that for looked after children. They must too make sure that the children that they're looking after have access to good, meaningful childcare that addresses early learning. The others will come in on that, but before I finish, in terms of the efficiency or the efficacy of the Disability Discrimination Act, we've been calling for reform to that legislation. Just when we're talking about children in a nursery, preschool, primary school setting, the DDA doesn't actually cover that. It's about the way in which we would support those cases is about the failure of a school to make reasonable adjustments. There is no compensation or anything like that. It's merely a statement that the child has been discriminated against. When you go into secondary school and further education, the system is somewhat different, and there is compensation payable. So that in itself requires amendment. We see some horrible cases coming before us in the Equality Commission through our Legal Funding Committee of parents who are really struggling to have their voice heard, to be able to demonstrate they have done the best they can for their child. And I think that's a problem with the law if they have to go to that extreme to be heard. Darren, do you want to come in?
Very quickly, yeah, we always talk about families in the roundest sense, and that way carers get express mention in our work. We're very clear that provision has to meet both for them and their children in terms of their journey through life, but also actually in dealing in terms of any wider issues that the child may face. Catherine, do you want to say? I'm sorry, Section 75.
On the specifics, but it's and my concern is about the mechanisms and the availability of provision, because particularly in around foster care, it's placements are made very, very quickly at a weekend. And industry, I'm just thinking in terms of industry, is already indicating that they don't have the capacity even to increase perhaps to 22.5 hours and so on. So the conversations need to be had. But having had the experience myself, I know how hard it is to then. So I'm just thinking, is there a way that we, if this is a protected group, for instance, that there are ring-fenced places? I know it's a big ask, but is it something, because these children are particularly vulnerable?
Mm-hmm. Certainly within Section 75, when the Department, etc., is working on policies, they should be considering the needs of carers under the with or without dependence aspects of Section 75. So there's an absolute requirement to consider how they advance equality of opportunity for that group. Clearly, for a number of groups, the importance of accessible care at a range of hours is very important, and we would see carers as one of the groups within that, but we accept the difficulty. Catherine, do you want to say anything about DDO.
Yeah, and
I saw you getting on the DDO stuff.
We very much agree reform is needed. Obviously, we as the Equality Commission continue to call for single equality legislation, but in the absence of that, urgent reform is needed to the DDA and indeed SENDO. For instance, at the minute, under the DDA, there's no protection against indirect discrimination, against discrimination arising from a disability. There's differences in terms of the reasonable adjustment protections Geraldine mentioned for service providers, so that might be private sector daycare compared to what's available in preschool, primary schools under SENDO. To be honest, I can see your face that it's very confusing, the whole.
Well, it's very disappointing, and we've seen a couple of cases publicly where a child, particularly, I think it was one who had Down syndrome, was refused a place. Now, I'm not going to get into the minutiae of the school because there are issues, but I can't believe in 2023, 24 that we're in this position.
We've seen some really horrible cases. The child with Down syndrome, where the hours at which the child could attend school were changed, so that the child wasn't coming in and out with other kids.
And had a shorter school day ultimately. They were arriving late and leaving early, you know.
And that's why it's so important in all of these. I mean, we can make all the legislation and moves a day. If we fail to support these children and don't learn from the mistakes of our past, then we're failing again.
It's really, why Darren has mentioned Section 75. When you're developing policy or you're reviewing policy, where have you considered these very kids and others who will be disadvantaged or will not be given the same opportunity as other kids?
And it's also why we would hope to deal with that at the start of the chain in terms of the consideration. Where it isn't dealt with, that's also where the importance, ultimately, the law comes in, and ultimately of the Commission to be able to support those cases and then promote them, because we don't want that happening again,
Exactly, because as I was just saying, it is really confusing, the different protections, DDA and SENDO, and without people knowing what their rights are, they're not able to fight it. So this family thankfully did come to us, and hopefully others will if there's any issues, but it's raising awareness of those cases because the legislation as it stands is so inconsistent. It's really confusing.
That's my experience. Thank you.
Well, that's to a close on that one, but thank you for that. David, you were in next.
Thanks very much, Chair. My question or indication was mainly to get clarification on something you talked about with both Kate and the Chair, and that was those pots you said, the small pots that are available, but only 10% of providers are accessing. Is that is that down to criteria? Is it down to those being very specialised for certain things? Is it down to awareness of some of those pots being available to some? And what are those pots? If we can have a bit more detail on that, just with the department coming in after.
So there's different bits, and to be honest, your next panel might be better able to add the detail. But so yes, that was the DE research from last year when they spoke to providers, and they spoke to a wide range of providers. I think it was 13% said they accessed that funding. So there's different things in there. There's the likes of Fair Play, which provides specific funding for supporting disabled children, and it looks at things like even like holiday schemes and stuff as well. There's the likes of Bright Start and different pots that are there. But my understanding is most of them are competitive. You have to apply. There might be limited funding, and we know, I wasn't listening to the panel before, but I can imagine it. There is obviously strains in the budget. There's also, we know that providers are under a lot of strain. So knowing what's there, making it clear to everybody, including the likes of childminders, that information is shared and that they're aware of what's available and that they're supported to be able to apply for those.
If I just add to that, any funding programme moving forward, it's really important that support that's given to providers isn't lost in terms of how they might pass on fees. Not that they would, but the fees that parents pay or carers pay, what is the impact on them, so that there's clarity in terms of who's actually paying for what.
No, absolutely agree. Thanks very much. The only other thing was, and I think again you touched on it, was talking about disabilities, and obviously we are aware that disability covers a huge breadth of things. Is there, whilst all will no doubt face an element of disadvantage, are there forms of disability, whether it's physical disability, learning difficulties and so on, that you feel are facing a particularly stern challenge in terms of being able to navigate the obstacles in their way to childcare and provision?
Suppose to go back to the data, that's one area where it would be helpful to get more information, and I appreciate it will be difficult, you know, for particular disabilities it might be hard to get sample sizes and things like that, but qualitative data and speaking to parents and speaking to specialists in different conditions will help with that. So yeah, more data.
I think the concerns about data are well understood by committee across a number of sessions we've had as well. So.
I think it's important to recognise that to avail of special educational needs or equipment or whatever within a school, regardless of whether it's preschool, primary or secondary, or indeed post-secondary, you still need to have a statement of educational needs, and that can cover physical disabilities as well as kids with learning difficulties or whatever the disability might be. So a child that has a mobility issue is still in that same category, so they should not be lost. So that's just the only point I'd make in that regard.
I think just to add to that, as Catherine has highlighted, that it would be very helpful to have that additional information across different types of disabilities to be able to target interventions more effectively. But just to make an additional point, that it would also be really helpful to have additional equality data on children with disabilities. What additional equality characteristics do they also have? Do we have children with special education needs and disability who also speak English as an additional language, for example? And that sort of information would be very helpful.
Thank you.
Yeah, Danny, you were next.
Thank you, Chair. Actually, my question's actually just going to come from an email I opened that I just came in, and it was from a parent as around placements and something that's been described to us by officials that we're not in a crisis when it comes to placing children with special educational needs, and so many of them who are without placements right now. And that parent just reading the email, their peers have all got their places, and this child hasn't got their place as of yet. Has a statement, has a classroom assistant, and this is my frustration. And I've raised this a couple of times around supernumerary, and I have been calling and hoping that the department and the minister will consider a different approach and a send first approach going forward with school placements. And I was just wondering what your view would be on that, particularly around supernumerary, because I think it's discriminating against children and families.
Well, I think my initial view would be not in crisis. I would ask that question back. You know, all you have to do is listen, listen to the radio, the TV, every summer, sort of from May right through to end of September, October, where parents are pleading for information about places. We believe that children with special educational needs should be, you know, informed of their place in the school at the same time as every other child. Why should they be treated differently? I think it's important to note as well that my view as Chief Commissioner is that we're building a problem that we are really going to struggle with. We're struggling now, and it's going to be absolute crisis if it's not already in the very near future, because the number of children with statements, the number of special education needs children is growing year on year. I don't think there's a proper understanding of why that is. I think as children move through the system and you know, transition from one school to the next, it's going to become even more difficult to place those children. You know, preschool is a policy position as opposed to a legislative position. And if we're having difficulty finding places for children at that preschool level, how are we not going to have difficulty getting them into primary school and then into secondary school and transitioning, like Caleb that you referred to earlier? Where are we making accommodation for them? So that's all I want to say from a real Chief Commissioner's, you know, viewpoint. I feel very passionate about that one, but I'm going to let the experts speak.
Well, placement is an equality issue. As Geraldine said, children with SEN should be placed at the same time, and they should be communicated about that placement at the same time as children without SEN. Regarding supernumerary, it's not a term that we use within any of our policy positions. And relating to SEN first, as touched upon earlier, it's really essential that there is this cross-departmental work and there's transition planning, that EA is using data that they have access to plan appropriate transitions for children, so that we're not in the situation in which we're in at the minute. The only thing I would maybe just add, because a lot of the conversation tends to focus on placements, is that the inequalities in relation to SEN go much beyond just placement. And if you look at any metric of education, children with SEN tend to perform more poorly than children without SEN. So whether it's attendance, attainment, experience of prejudice-based bullying, experience of restrictive practice, those are all being disproportionately experienced by children with SEN. So it's just to highlight that the placements issue is essential, but there's a whole range of wider inequalities that also need to be addressed.
I would draw out 2 points very quickly. Just you heard from the independent review last week about the need to solve and resolve SEN provision. There's obviously year-on-year increases, and they had some suggestions about training for teachers and things like that might assist. So it's clearly important to plan for the future. But also in any given year, there was another suggestion, I'm not sure if it was in evidence or beyond that actually the numbers with statements are fairly predictable, so there's no reason, or a sound suggestion was to plan the year ahead while those children are in P6, so that the schools that were potentially receiving them have a chance to make the appropriate physical adjustments if required to prepare for their arrival, so that it can be fully and properly accommodated. So that, I think that's a worthwhile suggestion as well.
But it's also about a wraparound service too for those children who have special needs. It's about making sure that the Department of Health or whoever is there to provide the additional therapies and meet the needs of those children, so that they have the same equality of opportunity to develop to their full potential. And if we have a system that doesn't enable therapy providers to come in to support that child, to aid its development in the widest context, then we are failing that child, and that child is suffering an inequity.
Yeah, that's actually going to be a wee follow-up questions. I want to say with maybe the possible
Briefly,
concerns
Daniel, we're
around
out of time,
special provision within mainstream schools as compared to a specialist school would definitely have that wraparound support.
Yeah, I think there was a lot of publicity about that, maybe even last September, where school placements were being offered where there wasn't the facility to provide therapies. If a child needs that therapy, that child should get that therapy. It shouldn't be a postcode lottery. It shouldn't be down to any other criteria other than the fact that they have a statement of needs that says they need it. And I think it's up to government to make sure that that's provided. And anything else is treating that child unfairly and unequally.
Right, thank you. Yeah, it's just Cheryl and
Thank you, and thank you so much. I think I could ask you so many questions, but I'll try to stick within the time. Just in terms of childminders, we've touched on it briefly about training. I suppose, what is your opinion on the accessibility for training to upskill childminders so they are able to look after children with SEN or even medical needs? I know David had touched on it in his question, but it seems that if you're a provider, there's more scope there that in terms of staff provision, people can get time off to get the training. If you're a childminder and you're basically a sole provider for that service, that's almost impossible. And childminding facilities are one of the things that are more affordable and more accessible, I suppose, within local areas. So it's just to see if the level of support there you find is adequate or it needs improved.
So it's a well-made point. I think childminders, there is some training available, so I think the likes of NICMA have, again, comes back to pots of money that maybe come from the private sector to provide wee bits of training for the providers who can get it, but it's making sure that everybody's aware of that and that they're able to access it. It's also, I suppose, looking at then minimum standards is being reviewed, that's coming up. That does look at issues around equality, around making sure that children with special educational needs and additional needs are considered, and make sure that the provision in childminders' homes meets their needs. So looking at that review, there may be further opportunities there, but it's really important to make that space so childminders, who are such a valued part of the childcare sector here, are able to meet the needs of all children as they want to. It's not through childminders not thinking about it or not wanting to, it's just having that opportunity. It's
about the flexibility of the trainer.
Yeah, exactly. And as you said there, the opportunity to do that training and the flexibility to get that support, because I know many that want to do that, but they're restricted because of
when training
when
takes
training's
place.
available, you know, or that's going to have an impact on their kind of wages as well. But I just wanted to touch again on the process of placements and the communication with parents. So what would be your opinion? I'm sure you've had many cases. You know, do you see that there's maybe flaws within the system in terms of that communication, in terms of language within the statements, in terms of confusion, you know, and how could that process be simplified and better?
Do you want to take that?
I think broadly, and I think Catherine touched upon this earlier, parents and carers find the entire process very opaque and confusing, that there isn't clear information available, that the pathway and the different pathways that might be available are not clearly communicated, and I think that applies to placements as well. So it would just be essential that those processes are designed in a way that enable parents to understand as clearly as possible what's
and the uncertainty of when you'll hear. I mean, obviously anxiety fills the gap then while you're waiting to hear. I'd make a quick point on the training thing, and it's a bit like the argument we make for childcare. You sort of touched on it. It has to be available at a time that then works for childminders who are in essence self-employed, working from home. They can't really take time off during the day when they're caring, so that it's available in evenings or at weekends or online. You know, that they have access to. That is a key thing.
I just add that in terms of communication of placements, I think every one of us have heard the stories on the media where parents have tried countless times to make contact with various people and it doesn't happen. Without making comment on the specifics of any of those, it's just a reminder that we all work in the public sector and we all know how to engage with customers and service users, and it's about courtesy and respect, and it must be extremely difficult for some of those coordinators or members of staff who have to deal with parents who are so distraught, but it's treating people with respect and dignity. I'm not commenting on the rights or wrongs of any particular case, but just we all should be doing that anyway.
Yeah, and it's such a sensitive subject for parents too, and heightened as well. And the last question, just in terms of
we're nearly out of time.
Are you aware of the under fours pathway? I understand within the Northern Trust there was a pilot that they're exploring at the minute in terms of speeding up the diagnosis and then obviously the statement process in terms of under fours children. As far as I'm aware, it seems to be quite successful. Have you heard anything about that, or would that be something you'd be?
I'm not aware of it. Are you aware of it? No, we're not aware of it, but we can certainly make inquiries.
Yeah, no, that's what I'm thinking.
And learn from best practice.
Thank you very much. I think that's all members' questions covered. There's a lot potentially for us to follow up, and I hope we will be engaging with you again, but before too long on some of these issues. I think as you've referenced, we have officials from the department coming in, so a lot of these issues around early years and childcare in particular will be covered. But I think there's possibly a number of actions arising from that briefing already that the committee will be following up on. So please do keep in touch with us.
Just to say thank you very much for the invitation. We're delighted to be here and assure you of our ongoing commitment and support in your work, holding the department to account.
We're glad to have you here. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
While the Quality Commission staff make their way out, there's some stuff I think that in terms of follow-up will be for the next briefing session again as before, so if there's outstanding actions at the end of that, we can pick all of that up. I think particularly some of the stuff around data, disaggregated data around those protected groups in terms of access to childcare and early years provision, I think is an important one. Other than that, is there anything else anyone wanted to raise? I think there was a lot of ground covered there around SEN. I think it's pretty clear that will continue to be top of our agenda, you know, in the period ahead, and I think particularly on the reform side, we hope that placements are delivered as in the most effective way possible in September, but I think we need to be shifting the focus beyond September to the reform piece and what the department are doing. So unless there's anything specific arising from that, I don't think we have our witnesses here from the department yet, do we? Have they arrived? No, not as yet. So we could take the opportunity for a quick comfort break, and then if we still don't have witnesses at that stage, we'll cover correspondence off. All right.
One thing I would say is that we have these two research briefings now on Children's Services Cooperation Act and then in detail on pooled budgets. So if the committee's agreeable, we can put those on the website and make them available to everybody and perhaps send them to the departments as well.
So we're all agreed on that. Yeah, great. Okay, great. So we'll take a quick comfort break to 4, and then we'll see where we are with witnesses.
Committee Room 29, sound. 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 Committee Room 29, Sound.
Okay, members, so that's us back in public session. So we don't have the yet from the department for our next briefing, so we'll clear everything else on the agenda and then be ready to go for that. So I will bring us then just jumping ahead to item 10, which is correspondence, and I would refer members to pages 241 to 315, and there's a summary note at 241, page 241 of the correspondence, and then we also had correspondence arrived in tabled papers today as well. So as usual, we'll go through anything where I think we need an action. There's actually not a huge amount that I think needs an action this week, but if I missed anything at all that anyone wants to highlight, please do so. Otherwise, we'll just dispose of it as per the note. So item 10.5 on page 272. It's a consolidated response from the Education Authority to several committee letters in relation to indoor air quality. So are members content to share this response with the individuals that originally raised the concerns? Is that agreed?
Good.
Okay. And then item 10.12 on page 26 of tabled papers. I'm going to shamelessly plug this. So as chair of the all-party group on parental participation in education, the Secretariat had just shared with the committee there the AGM for that is on Tuesday the 25th of June, 1 to 2 p.m. We also have a presentation at that from Unison on free school meals really encourage any members in the committee who are interested in that. It's been we've produced, hopefully we're going to be producing a really good report around the cost of access in education. We've heard really far and wide from a lot of stakeholders on that, and it's been a really good year in the APG. Be good to see some committee members on there if you fancy taking on a role for any of the positions there. So just put that one in your diaries. Other than that, there isn't any correspondence other than in tabled papers, I think, came through. Yes, so there was, we'd flagged it at the start. So I really just wanted to highlight, I'd had a meeting with Angel Eyes, the charity that works with children with visual impairments last week, and they were very keen to see if the committee would be interested in facilitating them to discuss a range of issues around provision for children with visual impairments, fits in with their agenda around SEN, but also, and Robbie will be aware of this through the APG on visual impairment, they have worked in partnership with, I think, with one of the universities to develop VR technology, and it has a very education-focused aspect to it to enable educators to experience what the classroom experience is like for a child with a visual impairment. From having trialled that in the APG is really impactful, and they're really keen to see if they can partner with the EA around actually, you know, ensuring the sensory service in the EA and schools could maybe potentially get access to this. So I think it would be a really welcome thing, and it's really just to note that if members are content, it would be a slightly different evidence session, but I think it would be very beneficial, and if that's something for forward work planning, we're happy to take forward after summer recess. Are we all agreed on that?
Agreed.
Okay. Are there any other items in table papers, Mark, that I've missed? Is there anything else that came through that any members want to highlight at all? No? Okay, so are we content then to dispose of the correspondence as per the note at page 241? Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Okay, that's great. So that takes us to forward work planning. So we had a brief discussion in closed session, which hopefully we'll just follow up next week once we've maybe got a wee bit of clarity just around members' diaries over the next number of weeks in terms of how we take the next number of weeks forward. But other than that, I just wanted to draw out, and I'm happy to hear from anyone else around any other items on the agenda for the weeks ahead. We have the Minister in next week, and I would just want to suggest, would there be, I know we'd hope to try and get members in a bit earlier to maybe discuss how we approach committee sessions. It hasn't always happened, but I think for the one with the Minister, I'd be keen to see if even sort of a 20 minutes or so earlier, just to make sure we're covering all the key issues and committee priorities. Are we all happy to try and facilitate that, diary permitting? Agreed? Yeah. Okay. Is there anything else in terms of forward work planning from your perspective, with Clark's perspective, if you want to highlight anything?
No, I've advised the panel, as the committee agreed last week, of the 4 topics for the independent review panel coming back. So the first are, they'll be with us on the 12th, and address disadvantage and childcare issues, and then the Minister will be in after that, and then on the 19th they'll address transition and area planning, and CCMS will be in after that, so they kind of flow into each other in a sense.
Can I just check, when you mentioned childcare, it's early years in childcare in its broadest sense? Yeah, early years,
yes,
yeah, because yes. I think they've quite wide ranging recommendations in early years, so I think it would be good to hear from them on that. Yeah, Kate.
Chair, in a couple of sessions we've raised newcomer children. Mm-hmm. I don't know if I'm missing it, but if that's something we could maybe look at one of the sessions, I'd suggested maybe we hear from Rebecca Lurda from Queen's University, who did some research on this. And it's quite wide-ranging research, but she does touch on the asylum seeker children as well.
Yeah, I'm certainly happy to see about getting a session in on that. Has that been something that's been taken forward as yet? It has been mentioned in a couple of sessions
before, yes, but we haven't got it scheduled because obviously we're trying to get to
keep it.
Yeah, I think probably before recesses. It may not be. I think given the what we've got in, we probably don't have scope to add anything new in really between now and recess. But I think we should have that one in for after recess, and it's definitely noted as one to have on an agenda.
Okay. Just checking the diary on the previous point, Chair, that I have something booked in next week, so I might not be here but I'll try my best to be here early for the meeting.
No problem, that's fine. Anything else on forward work planning, or are we happy to endorse that as a draft forward work plan? And then obviously we'll need to start thinking beyond recess fairly soon as well, but I can cross over with the clerk in relation to that. Okay, so on that basis, I'll just seek committee's agreement that we endorse the draft forward work plan. Are we agreed?
Agreed.
Agreed. Okay. And do we have witnesses here? So look, perfect timing. So that leads us on to item 9 on the agenda. So if members could refer to the briefing paper from the committee clerk, page 237 of your packs, and the department's briefing paper at page 239. I'm just going to bring the officials through and let them get settled, and then we'll make a start. Good afternoon. Good to have you here today. Thank you for coming to committee to brief us. And we've had a fairly wide-ranging discussion on issues that cross over with this area already today. So I think there'll probably be plenty of issues that members are looking to raise with you. So I'll just do quick introductions and then we'll make a start. So from the department today for the update on early years and childcare strategy, we have Paul Brush, Director of Early Years Childcare, Children and Young People Strategy from the department. We have Tina Dempster, Head of Early Learning and Childcare Team, also from the department, and Linda Drysdale, Head of Early Years Interventions Programmes Team in the department. So you're all very welcome. We have had quite a big agenda today, so we're looking for an initial presentation of up to 10 minutes, and then when we're moving into question and answer, it would be in the region of 5 minutes per member for each inquiry. So if we could ask again, just for members to get into questions quickly, and for officials to be succinct in their answers. But at this stage, I'll hand over to you for opening presentation, and we'll take it from there.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the opportunity to provide an update. I probably won't take the 10 minutes because you'll have seen the Minister's recent statement on this, which sets out a lot of the current positions. So just, I suppose, to pick out some of the highlights of that. As you will be aware, the Minister made a written ministerial statement on the 23rd of May, where he set out his plans for a package of measures which would be implemented in the current financial year, as agreed by the Executive that same day. This is a package worth 25 million and contains quite a range of measures aimed at addressing a number of issues in the early learning and childcare space. It's aimed, I guess, at stabilising, first of all, the existing provision, and I think that was a key objective of the package, that you wouldn't begin to build on a shaky foundation, and therefore there was a need to stabilise core provision. And there's a package there estimated at 7.1 million, which will be around supporting the sector and also growing elements of existing provision. So it's not just about standing still, it's about some incremental growth. The second area in the package is focused on supporting providers, and there's a recognition that some providers are experiencing financial difficulty, and that measure is aimed at addressing that. And obviously we can talk a bit more about that in due course. The third key element of the package is the beginning of the journey to provide all children in their preschool year 22.5 hours of preschool education. And that's clearly a long-term commitment. It won't happen in 1 year. It will take time, but it's the beginning of that process that is announced and has been costed for this year. The fourth area then is a measure aimed at reducing the costs of childcare for parents. This is around addressing the affordability challenges that so many are facing with the cost of their childcare fees. It's focused initially on parents who have children below primary school age, and it's also focused on those that are eligible for tax-free childcare, namely where both parents are working 16 hours a week, and the other criteria that are associated with that. The fifth area then is really, I guess, a piece to inform the longer term, and that's a major data development agenda. There is a lack of authoritative data currently on various aspects of this work, which would hinder the development of the longer term strategy. So the aim is to put in place this year a programme of data development that will both help us to assess the effectiveness of these measures and also inform the longer term. So it's a balanced package. It aims to address quite a range of issues. It won't do everything in the first year. The Minister's been very clear about that. It has been designed and informed by the input from the Task and Finish group. This is a group of officials from pretty much all departments that have been involved in bringing us to this point, and they will have a major role to play now as we move to implementing over the next 3 months. And on that, really, the focus has now turned straight away to implementation. There's a huge amount of work to be done to bring all of these to the market within the time frame that the Minister has set out. Clearly, those that involve some expansion of existing programmes can happen more quickly because the vehicle is already there, like Sure Start or Pathway, and the Minister has mentioned a few of those in his statement. Others, which are brand new initiatives, namely the subsidy scheme and the sector support scheme, need to be developed from scratch, albeit linked on existing eligibility criteria in the case of the subsidy scheme, and that will hopefully speed the process considerably. The Minister has made it clear that it is his intention to have these operational from September of this year, and that remains the objective. Obviously, this means that the focus of the team needs to be single-mindedly on this for the next 3 months. It also means that work on the longer-term strategy will basically pause for that period of time. However, it's not going to be lost time because the work on these interim measures will inform the longer term. And that's the plan. So, in conclusion, Chair, this is a hugely ambitious timescale, but we believe it's a realistic timescale. A lot of work has been going on behind the scenes to look at the operational detail, to assess what it would look like in terms of delivery. Engagements have been taking place with potential delivery agent. All sorts of mechanics that are needed now to put this into place, and we're confident that we can do it within the time frame available, on the assumption that no unforeseen obstacles emerge, which we wouldn't have anticipated.
Thank you, Paul. Sure.
Oh, thank
No, just to, no, I caught your indication there. Look, thank you for your presentation. I just want to raise, before we go any further, just a point of clarification from the briefing from your colleagues from Finance right at the start, just so we're clear what we're discussing here. There was a little bit of uncertainty around the resource that was going into this, because it certainly read from the ministerial statement this was all, the resource had been released and had approved by the executive, but your Finance colleagues seemed to suggest that wasn't quite over the line in terms of the resource that was being allocated from an executive level to this. Can you just maybe clarify where that sits, just so we know exactly what we're talking about at the outset?
I think it's more the mechanics of the release rather than anything else. We've been advised just in the last couple of days by DOF that we need to submit a bid for the 25 million in June monitoring, and that will be the mechanism by which it is released to the department. That bid has been submitted, so I have no reason to believe that there's anything other than simply that's the process to be gone through. But
there's no sense work is sort of paused waiting for the
absolutely
the green light.
not, because there's obviously a considerable amount of work now taking place to prepare in terms of business case development, in terms of lining up delivery, engagement with delivery agents. So there's no pause at the moment. Now, if that was delayed significantly, then it could have an impact, but at this stage it is not having an impact.
I thought it was just worth getting clarity on that at the outset, because I think there was a little bit of concern just highlighted in that initial briefing. I'll just move on and quickly, because I know other members are really keen to come in on this. But in terms of that, you've already identified it's a really ambitious timescale for September. I just want to be clear as well. You know, there is so much to welcome in the statement that was made. I think it's important when we call for things and ask for things, and then some of those materialise, that we should acknowledge that. So I think it's important to put on record the work to get us to this stage. But in previous engagements, you know, with yourselves in relation to this, and understandably, it had always been in terms of that subsidy model for the childcare providers and the mechanism then to bring about a reduction in costs. It had always been discussed in terms of it being really quite uncharted territory for the department, of being really quite complex and something that was a fairly big logistical task to deliver, and that there were a lot of risks and pitfalls associated with that in terms of the department intervening in the market. That there've always been a range of issues raised around the complexity of it. So I'm assuming none of that has changed. I'm just really wanting to seek that assurance of how can we have moved from that very strong emphasis on the complexity and the difficulty and the challenge to this will be delivered for September. Particularly, we're looking at the summer period, and we'll just be realistic. You know that staff have holidays booked, and all of those realistic, pragmatic considerations. Is this going to be ready for September? I sincerely hope it is, but the committee would be very keen to get those assurances as to how we can see that delivered, given the context of this.
Well, in terms of your point around the sort of uncharted territory, in terms of going into a scenario where you're capping fees, you're paying childcare providers to do so, we're not going there yet, and the proposals are an incremental step potentially in that direction, but they largely decouple the support for providers from the support for parents, although obviously they begin a relationship with providers and a partnership with providers. So in that sense, they are not as complex and I guess not as interventionist as the models some would like to have seen, but they will obviously inform the direction of travel. So in terms, for example, of the subsidy model to parents, there has been a huge amount of work already gone on, even in terms of engagement with HMRC and with Treasury, around the potential tax implications for parents in terms of getting a benefit in kind, all sorts of engagements that have gone on before the Minister's announcement. This work really with HMRC started back in February. There obviously had predated that when there had been calls for the UK government to increase the rate at which they were providing tax-free childcare. When it became clear that they weren't going to do that in the short term, the attention changed to, well, how could the Northern Ireland Executive put something in place that would complement and indeed piggyback on the eligibility criteria for that scheme? Because to set up new eligibility criteria within the time frame and verify all of that for every individual parent would not have been possible. So a lot of work has already happened to get us to the point where we're confident of being able to deliver something like this. But there, of course, remains challenges, and the team are meeting on a daily basis with sector representatives to understand, how this will land out there, how it would be administered, how an individual provider would bill parents, because essentially this requires them to identify those children that are eligible and bill them differently. But of course, all of that is ongoing. In terms of the childcare provider piece, where there would be a targeted application-based scheme, engagement has commenced with Invest Northern Ireland and the Department for the Economy, looking at what the parameters of that could be. We do have some experience of that sort of scheme, which operates for those providers that provide the preschool education programme, because currently if a preschool provider considers themselves to be at risk of closing and their closure would leave us without preschool places, they can apply to the Education Authority for support. So there are models there, but it's still a challenge because there are a whole range of subsidy regulations that have to be considered in that context as well, but the work's ongoing.
So, in short, expectations have been raised. Parents and providers are expecting this.
Yes.
Will this be delivered for September?
That is the aim.
Okay. Well, we sincerely hope that is the case. Okay, I'll bring Kathy in first.
Thanks. Sure. And much like the Chair has said, it is important to note that this is really, really welcome. And I know it'll be really welcome by parents and providers out there. I have to say, though, I am disappointed to hear that work will pause on the childcare strategy and the development of that. Saying that, I do appreciate that it is a small team that is working on this, and I appreciate pulling resources away from it for that. Is there no scope for expanding the team to ensure that the strategy isn't delayed any longer?
Well, there has been agreement within the department to expand the team. The challenge often then is actually getting the supply of people, and you're really dependent on the normal recruitment processes. So there is an intention and a commitment to expand the team, probably more in the medium term, but we're talking here really of the next 2 months. This is absolutely happening now. So obviously there's consideration around the potential even to sort of redeploy into the team, and we're exploring that. But that really is to deliver what the Minister has announced, and back to the previous question, to ensure that we do so for September. I don't think a couple of months, 2 or 3 months, focusing on this is really going to have a major impact in terms of the longer term strategy. In fact, I think it will help to inform that. Our discussions, our engagement with providers, the model that we're now proposing for these interim measures will, in a sense, determine the extent to which providers are prepared to enter into this sort of relationship, the extent to which even there are financial difficulties out there with a number of providers. That will be determined through the applications to this scheme. What are the nature of those issues? Is it just financial? Is it actually business support that they need? So it will inform, and while we don't necessarily describe them as a pilot, they are actually going to pilot some of those longer term aims.
Okay, thank you. I just want to pick up on the extension of the hours and the 22.5 hours, which again is a welcome step. My only, I suppose, question around that is that was something that was announced, I think, in September 22 by Minister McElveen at the time, and I'm just trying to clarify why that's coming out of this, why that's not coming out of an education budget, why it's coming out for this allocation of 25 million that's been set aside for childcare.
Well, Minister McElveen announced that in the context of her aims for an early learning and childcare strategy. And she said at the time that it would be her objective to have that at the core of any expanded provision, but it was very clear there was no funding available for it, and it would not proceed unless there was an allocation of funding. That's further, I guess, emphasised by the fact that we carried out a very small pilot to see which settings could transition and what was involved in transitioning, and only settings that could do that with no funding, no additional funding, were eligible to participate in that pilot. And over that intervening period, only 6 settings have been able to do that. So that gives you a sense of the very, very tentative steps that were taken as a result of the Minister's announcement at that stage. There are something like 550 settings that will need to transition, and there was never any question that that could be done out of the mainstream department's budget. So it was clear from the outset that this would not be done unless it was part of the strategy and the allocation of funding for the strategy.
Right. It still would be my view that this would fall under education as opposed to childcare, and it would be 2 sort of separate elements. But I want to move on because I want to cover around special educational needs, and you'll be well aware of the crisis that's taking place at the minute in terms of placing these children. And I know that there is an allocation within this around special education needs, but it's very vague. Do you have more detail as to exactly what that will mean or what that will look like?
A lot of that detail is still being worked through in terms of the stabilisation and the 7.1 million. There is a mention in there in the Minister's statement of supporting children with special needs and additional needs. We are engaging with other departments on this because it clearly links in with health as well. It is very much linking in with the end-to-end review of special educational needs provision. Do you want to say a little bit more about the engage? We haven't finalised, so there's a limit to what we can give you in terms of detail, but you might be able to provide a bit more.
Yeah, I mean, we have been meeting with our colleagues in health because it's very much, because we're in the early years, obviously, and they have a lot of role in this in terms of health visiting and social services and trusts and etc. So we have been engaging with them that for some of their schemes that could be potentially enhanced to support as part of falling within that 7.1 million package. And again, we're linking very closely with our SEN colleagues in the department who are also focusing more on the early years as well as part of the end-to-end review. So there will be some pilots even that we're developing with them and looking at how that can work, along with working with existing schemes that health have, and then ultimately longer term how we bring all this together with them, but to get that immediate stabilisation and some enhancement because we're aware of the difficulties in that area.
Right. And again, and I appreciate
on this last point,
I appreciate that you're still working through the details of that, but we're talking about maybe some of this being rolled out in September. That clearly won't be something that will be happening in September if we're still waiting.
Well, some of the existing schemes, they could be, because the vehicles, as Paul mentioned earlier, the vehicle's already there. So it's given that enhancement to those existing schemes.
That Sure Start and
no, there are other schemes within health that support like training for providers with special educational needs. They're for resources and equipment. They also have some funding schemes for that. So we're working with them closely to try and how can we support those and bolster those existing schemes, as well as working with our SEN colleagues on some pilots that could very quickly come into play.
Just really briefly on that, like
the answer would be brief as well.
On this. I think one thing that's clearly missing from this is around childminders and what support they'll be able to access through this. And when we do speak about special educational needs, and we do see a lot of cases where those children possibly are going to a childminder setting rather than a provider.
Some of those schemes within the Department of Health do include childminders, and any of the package of measures we're talking about here in the emergency support scheme, the subsidy scheme, they will all be inclusive of childminders.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Chet. Thank you. And I know I have you tortured with the number of questions I put in about childcare, and I want to put on record my gratitude for the work that you particularly have done, Paul and Tina, on this, and it's no mean feat, and there is so much within the statement to be really welcome, and I know lots of people are really celebrating it. I've got a number of questions, unsurprisingly. The first one is, will childcare vouchers be included in the subsidy scheme? Will people on childcare vouchers be able to avail of it?
Well, look, this is something we're looking at, and you've raised it, and others have too. It's not as straightforward as it might seem. The eligibility criteria for childcare vouchers is different from tax-free childcare, and the executive clearly had a paper recommending that they build on tax-free childcare, which is the current scheme operated by UKG. The vouchers is the legacy scheme. There clearly are still people claiming them. Both parents don't have to be working 16 hours a week to claim the vouchers, so immediately you're into a difference there. Equally, the caps on the tax-free childcare of 100,000 a year doesn't apply in case of the vouchers. Also, you can claim universal credit if you're claiming the vouchers, which isn't the case for tax-free childcare. One of the real reasons for focusing on tax-free childcare initially was to ensure that we didn't displace childcare funding that is going out through other sources.
To increase uplift of it, because we know enough people aren't using it. Yeah.
But even the sort of universal credit point, like the amount of childcare support that's going out through universal credit is really significant. Within the last 3 years, 80 million has been paid out in Northern Ireland to parents claiming universal credit. So we wouldn't want to inadvertently bring that scheme within scope and simply reduce their universal credit payment and replace it with an executive top-up. But we're looking at all of this.
Okay. So many parents have been in touch with me and they're very keen that they are included in the scheme. But I'm grateful that you'll be looking at it. How will the emergency payment be accessed for those at risk?
Again, it's too early to say. Like it will be application based. There will be criteria published well in advance. We're working through with InvestNI, Department of Health, which also has a remit in all of this, and DFE, looking at, as I say, the experience we have of operating this sort of scheme for preschool providers. There will clearly be a requirement for applicants to provide details of their need, of their financial position, of whatever the issue is that they feel could be supported through this scheme. So it will be open, as Tina says, to both childminders and daycare settings. But the work on all of the detail has still to be completed.
Okay. I think because everyone, and the chair has already highlighted that, because expectations have been risen, people are just desperate for the detail now. And I appreciate that you're working through it. The Task and Finish group has only met twice, maybe 3 times since one of my questions I've submitted. How regularly is that group going to be meeting? And will there be information coming from that on as people are trying to plan for the future, so they need to know what they can expect? And so will there be more information released as the group meets, or is there going to be another announcement in a couple of months' time saying this is what it's going to look like? Can we have more information as it comes?
Yes. On that, we're planning to do a frequently asked questions piece and put it online and keep it up to date on an ongoing basis.
That would be great.
So that's our intention. So within the next, hopefully, few weeks, we would have a first cut of that, which would cover a number of those questions, like will vouchers be included? How will I access? In some cases, the answer will be we don't know yet, or we would hope to come out with an answer on that issue by such and such a date. But I think it would go some way, I think, to providing that sense of openness that people are looking for. In terms of the Task and Finish group, they will have a role in populating some of those. I wouldn't, to be honest, I don't think you should read too much into the fact that they've only met 2 or 3 times, because that in no way indicates the level of engagement that there's been between us and members of that group. You know, in terms of, for example, the whole role of universal credit in this space, and a desire to ensure that anything we do now does not displace that. There will have been dozens of engagements with the individual officials in that department. So I don't think the meetings of the whole group are necessarily the best measure of the activity of the group. There's a meeting of it next week. Yeah, next Tuesday. We're also meeting with stakeholders. We have a meeting tomorrow with a group of representative bodies and parents' representatives as well. That will be an ongoing process, but we would like to use the frequently asked questions, I think, as a way of managing the questions to some extent, because, as I say, we need to focus on delivery, and if we are constantly asking individual questions, I don't mean from elected representatives. Individual questions.
There's no information on it. No, I accept that. I accept that. And the reason why I'm asking all these questions is because there is a lack of clarity. But that would be really welcome. And I appreciate the clarity around the amount that the Task and Finish group is meeting, because I appreciate that would be bilaterals. I know I'm about to be stopped. So the last thing I want to say is that Kathy's point on SEN children is really important. Information on that and what parents with children who have SEN, if more information on that as soon as possible would be great. And preschool is not childcare. I appreciate that it has been put into this package, and it is my opinion that it's a political reason. Why has not more work been done on standardisation of preschool? I don't accept that it was clear that it was budget reliant. And is the Minister minded to publish the RSM report?
I'm going to have to ask to cover all that really, really rapidly.
It's not childcare. This is an early learning and childcare strategy, so we don't make any apology for it being included within that broader spectrum.
In terms, just come in there, it should absolutely be covered in the strategy, but the announcement felt like a childcare announcement, and I think it's just the worry that the two are conflated sometimes in the public messaging.
But so much of the announcement was around the expansion of Sure Start, which again is not predominantly childcare, it's entirely early learning and childcare. So if that was the impression, it's not the right impression. It is a much wider piece than that. In terms of your question around the report, the Minister has yet to consider the report. I envisage it will be published. It's a huge report, and it will give a very clear roadmap now for actually standardising settings, and it will show which are ready to go, which need a little bit of support, what are the key things that those that maybe need a bit more support are. So it will be a really useful opening up of the debate around how quickly we can transition to
And it will highlight that it won't be ready by September 2025. Standardisation.
The first tranche.
I'm gonna have to
First tranche, 2,200 places by September 2025.
Okay.
The first tranche.
Other members may wish to pick up preschool standardisation. So, Cheryl, do you want to come in?
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you so much. Obviously, childcare was a day one priority for us, so the announcement was absolutely fantastic. And of course, I welcome it. In terms of the tax-free childcare, and we've touched on that, it was discussed actually in Parliament a number of weeks ago about the number of people in the UK that are eligible, and I think it's around 1.2 million, but they're not actually aware of the number of parents that are eligible that aren't applying. Is that something within the bigger data piece that can be discovered? And if you do know the figures, or you do know there's a significant gap in who's eligible and not applying, what is actually being done to encourage parents to apply for that tax-free childcare at this stage?
Well, we know that even in Northern Ireland, the number eligible, just a proportion of them are actually applying. I don't have the figures off the top of my head.
Yeah, no.
We can write to you with that, but we do know it is known. And one of the real benefits of tying the subsidy to tax-free childcare could well be a driving up of claiming of tax-free childcare, because parents may well have decided 20% it isn't worth my while for one reason or another, but when you add the subsidy on top of it, it may well become worth your while. It may also encourage providers that are not registered, and therefore parents can't access tax-free childcare, to move into the registered space, because there's pressure from parents to do so, because only when they're offering tax-free childcare can they get the top up.
Can I just add to that too? We have been doing promotional campaigns over this last year or 2 years to try and increase tax-free childcare. And actually, when you look across the regions from the HMRC figures, we have had the biggest increase. We're still low compared to the numbers eligible. We've had the biggest increase in people taking it up across all the regions. So some of that promotional campaign work, I think, is working. And we're working with Health again to do more this year. And again, we will be linking this with the subsidy scheme that we're proposing this year as well.
Oh, that's good, because I know employers for childcare would do a lot of work, and I think some of us here have had them in the office, and the work that they're doing is fantastic in allowing us to know exactly what's available for parents, but it's trying to make sure people go through that process, which is quite simple to get, but as you say, it may drive that all up. It was actually just a point Kathy made in terms of childminders, and I definitely welcome that they will be included in the piece for training. But in terms of flexibility for childcare, they're almost slightly different than the childcare providers as such. They're potentially on their own. Is there going to be a flexibility included for the training that they can, whether it be out of hours or slightly more accessible for them?
There is training available at this point, and Health do offer quite a significant training package, and they work with NICMA, the Child Mountain Association, who do deliver. They deliver at the weekends, they deliver in evenings. So when we're working with Health and NICMA and Unite, the child minding branch of that as well, all of those things are taken into account. So it's how can we increase that, and we're going to work with our health colleagues as part of the overall 7.1 million package.
Well, that's great. And the last one then, just in terms of the affordability and the eligibility, to kind of get my head around this, have you narrowed down the eligibility criteria at this stage, or will that be further down the line?
For the subsidy scheme?
Yes, yeah, for
No, that's pretty clearly defined, subject to discussions around the vouchers. But as set out, parents who are eligible for and claiming tax-free childcare. When you're claiming tax-free childcare, you're required every 3 months
Yes.
to reconfirm your eligibility details, and you receive confirmation from HMRC that you're still eligible. That would largely be your verification that your provider would use to give you the discount that the executive is paying. Again, it's further narrowed in on parents who have children of before primary school age. So a child from 0 up to they go to primary school would be eligible for that discount.
No, that's great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. David, you'd indicated next.
Yes, thank you very much, Chair. And as Chair and Cheryl said, very much to welcome in the statement. And Cheryl Dugburn, Trial Chair, say a representative melted parents in the room as well, and they've done an awful lot of work, and I think should be recognised as well. And obviously, from a political point of view, childcare has been a priority for our party, and supporting working parents and working families was part of our own 5-point plan. And I know Gavin Robinson done an awful lot of work on that. Some of the SEND stuff was covered off, I think, that I was going to draw on from the previous session from Kathy's question. So the only question I wanted to get clarity on was you talked about your engagement with HMRC earlier. And how did those sort of discussions conclude? Are we satisfied that there won't be a negative effect, an unintended negative effect of giving subsidy? Because I know from previous instances of support payments, bonuses over COVID, for instance, some of our healthcare workers and so on faced negative consequences. Can we be sure that that's not going to happen with this scheme?
Yes, they have provided confirmation that based on the proposal we put to them, which of course only related to tax-free childcare, and the parameters could change again if we attempted to widen it, but based on what we were putting to them, that parents would not be eligible for income tax or national insurance contributions. And in terms of providers, because the funding would go through a provider, it effectively replaces one source of funding with another, and therefore should not impact their overall tax burden.
That's Robbie, you had indicated.
Thank you. Just a couple of brief questions, because I think some of the questions have been really good. And I know that some members are sending you questions all the time and taking up all your time, Paul. So, so we had the Equality Commission just previously, and so I'll just ask you the same questions because you guys are now doing the policy and the regs and so on. So in regard to access for children with a disability, and probably not a statement because they'll be quite young, but that disability access, is there work being done to ensure that all children have access regardless of their complexity or the settings that are being considered, have the spaces, and then the total spaces that will be allocated that will have that inclusive nature. And then also the question that I asked them in and around, so they use the term carers, but I use obviously children who are looked after, and whether it's foster parents, adoptive kinship and so on. That's quite flexible, Paul, as you will know. These things happen at a weekend, and children come to a family very quickly. So is there capacity being built in to ensure that those children who are at the very sharp end of vulnerabilities do assist? Because I agree with your point that this is about education and childcare. I like that, but it needs to be open to all, and these are the pinch points that have been evidenced in the past.
Well, I'll say a little bit first about the data collection piece, because I think we haven't really mentioned it, and I think it will be key to evidencing some of what you've just asked. And there will be two aspects to it. There will be a data collection from providers that will ask a lot of detail around the children they have, the needs that they have, their perceived ability to address those and deal with those. There will also be a survey of parents, a statistical survey carried out by NISRA that will include a range of questions around parents' perceived access to childcare, what are the barriers for them, and move into, obviously beyond what you're asking, but move into questions around what would it take for them to actually re-enter the labour market, because a child with disabilities or additional needs often can be an additional barrier as well as the sort of normal childcare barrier. So that data collection piece will shed a lot of light on that. But in terms of what we currently do that supports those kids, maybe Linda, you would say a little bit.
So in terms of Sure Start then, It is open to all in the area in which it's delivered. So, and with the aim to support whatever the specific needs of those children are, and the parents indeed as well, supporting both. So Sure Start's currently delivered to 48% of children, although our policy aim is to the 25% most disadvantaged areas. Actually about 48% of target age children can receive that service. So it's very much about encouraging children and families in, and then looking at what are their specific needs and disabilities, and then providing that targeted and specific support in terms of what their needs are. The Pathway Fund then, which we have in addition to Sure Start, so round about the same age range, although up to age 4, and it in some ways it meets where Sure Start isn't provided. It meets gaps where in areas where Sure Start isn't there. So it doesn't specifically focus on geographical areas. It looks at what are the individual needs, and we have some criteria for projects that apply to that, and one of those would be about improving access to provision, because we know that there are barriers that will prevent children from being able to access particular support that they need in those early years. So those are a couple of things that we do to make sure that children are identified in the first instance, and then that they're provided with the support.
Okay, so the other one then was about looked after children, in terms of is there going to be space in there to ensure that that those children are not precluded, because sometimes they're placed at short notice. And then one point on the Sure Start that just occurred to me at a conversation that I had, that I thought Sure Start was like regionally the same, and it's not, because some of it's financed under health and some's financed under education. I think there are different contractual pay grades for sure within Sure Start provisions.
It's wholly funded by the Department of Education.
Okay, so there
but
are
delivered through the Department of Health.
Yes.
But the employers, I think that's what
That's
you're
the
getting
point
at, is
then.
that the employers there are 38 Sure Start projects, and they can have different employers, and each employer will have their own terms and conditions and whatever. So
seems just for a small region like us, it seems unnecessarily. It shouldn't. I can't think of why there should be a difference if it's coming out of the Department of Education budget.
Yeah.
I mean,
I would say it's from where the project originally derived. So it was set up here in 2000, just after it was set up in England. And one of the key aspects of Sure Start is to meet local need. So it's involving community organisations and statutory organisations in a particular area, and looking at what's their particular needs. So and then one of those bodies will perform the role of employer. So that's how it comes about, and that's why you have those different employers.
I think it's brilliant. Okay, I think Sure Start's phenomenal, but I cannot see a rationale why staff are paid a different rate regardless of where they are. I want to flag it just as something that perhaps should be looked at by the department in that, because it's kind of silly. Like I get why we've maybe got there, but if we're going to expand Sure Start, we certainly shouldn't be expanding the disparity. We should be addressing that disparity, if that's okay, because that's part of the workforce issue. Because I see Sure Start as a really key help in the development here, especially in that first start and the best start in life for our children.
They are working to get Sure Start in to brief the committee, and I think those are issues they would like to raise. So that is something that we'll hopefully hear from soon.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, Kate, you were looking. You wanted to kind of just to clarify something, and that's fine.
Your response to Robbie's question around data in the NISRA survey, when is that expected to go out?
Well, we're starting over the summer. The aim is to start to define the questions, and of course we will want input to that process from others. I was just thinking earlier today, it would be useful for us even to have the likes of the Equality Commission input to that process, to make sure that the questions are as rounded as they possibly can be. The aim, as things currently stand, then would be for the survey to go into the field probably November, December, which would be quite good timing in that the interim measures that will have launched in September will have had an opportunity to take effect, and parents can also be asked around, well, what impact are they having on your decision making? how would they need to change to impact your decision making, for example, in terms of increasing your hours or going back into the labour market or whatever?
And look, thank you, members. We've got through a huge amount of material today, but that's the end of that evidence session. And I mean this sincerely. I hope when you're next in front of us, we're congratulating you on delivering this for September, because I think it's, it is.
Just to stop Kate emailing you every day.
I don't need to. They're setting up a Q&A section, which I think is great.
So, thank you for your contributions today. Thank you. Okay, so while the officials make their way out, can I just clarify if there are any actions arising from that? I know there were maybe some actions from previous briefings that we wanted to raise. Is there anything any members particularly want to highlight, or through the clock if there's anything?
Cheryl, were you satisfied in the end with your question about the tax-free childcare?
I think they're going to send the figures, which will be very useful just to see how many people aren't accessing that.
I would be keen just to follow up with some of the key points that we've made in writing. So I think clarity around is important. I think actually having a timeline of implementation, we know that the team's going to be working really hard over the next 3 months, but I really don't want us to find out what it's going to look like in 3 months' time. Like, I think we need to be getting regular updates, even if that means we write regularly just to see where we are with it.
I think really this is the last opportunity we will have as a committee with recess coming to engage with them. So I think anything going in writing is something we should follow up. So a timeline for delivery, Kathy?
Just on that, like, we're talking about September. We're obviously heading into recess.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about this being implemented in September. Is there an opportunity to have those guys back in September, maybe, to get an update at that stage?
The earliest possible update post-recess would be
And
welcome.
if they could even provide written briefings over the summer to members of the committee, because parents are going to be desperate to know what they can expect. People are actually have put off expanding their families because they couldn't afford childcare, and then there's been this big announcement which is potentially life-changing.
I thought they were getting it in September this year. I think a lot of people that have contacted me have been asking. Sorry for cutting across your chair, but
that's what we're still working towards. Like, I'm very
2020,
nervous.
2025 is the date for the
standardisation.
The standardisation of preschool, but the actual subsidy is meant to be in place in the next 3 months. The Task and Finish group has, I know you said not to count the number of times it's met, but it's met twice, and they've got to come up with, like, starting from scratch. They've got to start from scratch with the subsidy scheme and for the emergency payment. Like, that is very ambitious. So I think if we could get written briefings over the summer.
So at this stage then, if we're asking for a written confirmation of the anticipated timeline for delivery, an undertaking from officials that they will come to committee early after recess, and then a undertaking to keep members of the committee updated in terms of the delivery of this over the summer. And I think, I don't know how you quite word this in a letter, but that should be both good news and bad news. If things are not going to plan, we need early warning on that, and I think it's really important we get that. So.
We try. They just said also about the frequently asked questions. I think that's key to kind of get that clarified exactly.
If we can know when that's going to be available on the site. Yeah.
Sorry, final point is also just clarity on if people who avail of the childcare vouchers will be able to avail of the subsidy scheme. We're getting lots of queries about that, and I think it's really important.
I don't think any parent should suffer any detriment because of which scheme they happen to access support from.
And the point about universal credit, I think, I'm not sure that really applies to. Yeah, I think, like, if that scheme is there as a subsidy, then it should be everyone who is entitled to it.
Okay, I think that's plenty to follow up there. Yeah, so always a topic that exercises us. So thanks to members for getting through that session and for being really direct with your questions. I think we covered a lot of ground there, so it's very much appreciated. We've covered all the other items in the agenda, other than item 12. Any other business? Is there any other business? No. And that then is item 13, date, time and place of next meeting, which is scheduled for Wednesday the 12th of June at 2 p.m, room 29, Parliament Buildings. But if we could come that little bit early just to prep for the Minister's attendance. Will I just put the question that the committee does now adjourn? Are we agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you.
Thank you. Committee room 29, sound. Committee Room 29, sound. Committee Room 29, sound. Committee Room 29, sound. Committee Room 29, sound.